Chapter 7:15. When the anaconda appeared, most of the magic casters present thought that the battle had taken a huge turn for the better. The giant anaconda that Kola had conjured was already displaying the power of a 5th-tier spell. However, a round orange ball then fell from the sky. It crushed the blue anaconda and knocked Kola unconscious. The outcome had been decided. Everything fell silent again. The only things that remained were a massive orange cat that resembled a giant ball and Kola, who was foaming at the mouth beneath the giant cat. Holy fuck! After a long while, a magic caster finally found the right word to express his feelings. Meow. Ugly Duckling stared at the massive ball in Meg's hand, then looked down at its belly, which was gradually becoming round. It took a deep breath and tried to shrink its belly a little. As expected, this is the correct way to unleash an orange cat's innate talent. Meg was also in awe. Thankfully, it wasn't his main body that had fallen from the sky. After a long period of silence, the crowd suddenly erupted into an uproar. All of the magic casters were discussing the science behind the use of fantasy empowerment. This was like a one-time use spell. If it didn't land on its target, then the spell would be completely useless. However, if it did land on its target, then a 5th-tier magic caster's magic and body clearly wouldn't be able to withstand such a simple and brutal attack. Crassus turned to Richard with a wide smile on his face. Richard, your disciple can't move anymore. In that case, Amy should have one, right? Give me my fire spirit lotus and flame spirit crystal. After being humiliated 3 times in a row, Richard's expression was extremely dark. He flipped his hand over, and the fire spirit lotus and flame spirit crystal appeared in his hand. He tossed them toward Crassus with a cold smile on his face. All you've learned is trickery. Let's see what kind of disciple you're going to teach in the future. Crassus caught the 2 spirit items with a wave of his hand. He took a glance at them, and the smile on his face widened even further. He stowed them away with a smile and said, "Isn't it obvious? Of course, I still have to thank you for these 2 fire-type spiritual items. That's right. I'm a genius who can easily beat the Magus Tower." Richard turned to Crassus with an enraged expression. Crassus, you've spent several decades in the Magus Tower, yet you're opposing our Magus Tower at every turn. Are you really not going to give us any face? I, Crassus, have never been a person who cares about feelings. I only care about reason. Crassus glanced at the mages present and grinned. Also, I have a habit. If my things are damaged by others, I will destroy them and make a new one. Everyone fell silent. All the magicians had complicated expressions on their faces. Richard's lips twitched, but he didn't say anything in the end. Amy walked back and pinched Ugly Duckling's face with a serious expression as she said, "Ugly Duckling, did you see that? If you keep eating, you'll become like this. When that happens, I'll have no choice but to throw you out and smash you into bad people." Meow. Ugly Duckling shuddered as it imagined itself becoming a ball and being thrown out by Amy, and it shook its head with an aggrieved expression. "Little Amy, Mr. Mac, let's go." Crassus turned and made his way over to Meg and the others. He gave Amy a thumbs up and praised her with a benevolent smile. "Good job, little Amy." Crassus and the others departed from the Magus Tower. A hint of exhaustion appeared on Richard's face as he waved a hand and said, "You can all go now." A blue ribbon of water gently swept up Kola, and he disappeared from the hall. As expected of the god of fire, Master Crassus isn't going to destroy the Magus Tower, is he? If I'm not mistaken, all of the young magic casters of this generation are going to be crushed by this little half-elf magic caster. He's not just crushing. He's crushing them. He's crushing his peers. His peers are still learning how to walk. All of the magic casters dispersed, but those who were familiar with them were still discussing the battle that had just taken place. Even though it was only a battle between 2 5th-tier magic casters, it could very well decide the future of the magic world for the next several decades or even centuries. Brent had only just woken up from being slapped unconscious by Crassus, and he was greeted by the sight of Richard standing beside his bed. He hurriedly sat up. What happened? Richard's brows furrowed. Just a while ago, Brent gave Richard a recount of what had happened, and he hesitated momentarily before leaving out the part where he had been slapped by Amy. As a great magic caster, it would be far too embarrassing if he were to be slapped in the face by a 4-year-old half-elf kid with a chair. Richard's brows furrowed even further upon hearing this. Who would have thought that Irina would come to our Magus Tower to denounce us as soon as she arrived at Rodu? Looks like she already knows that we have something to do with this. Brent was a little panicked as he said, "President, what should we do now? Irina is simply too powerful. Aside from you, no one in our Magus Tower is a match for her. If she were to launch a sneak attack like she did today, no one would be able to survive. She didn't kill you, which means that she still doesn't know who was involved in what happened back then. Furthermore, this is Rodu, not the Wind Forest. She can't kill members of our Magus Tower just because she wants to. If she really wants to harm our Magus Tower, then even if we kill her in Rodu, the Elven race won't be able to do anything to us." Richard wasn't flustered in the slightest. "You're saying..." Brent's eyes lit up upon hearing this. Richard didn't continue Brent's sentence. Instead, he said, "Send someone to inform His Highness of Irina's arrival at Rodu. Perhaps His Highness will know how to deal with her." "All right." Brent hurriedly nodded before getting up from his bed and staggering out of the room. "Your Highness, you were the one who caused all of this, so you have to be the one to resolve it. Our Magus Tower won't take the blame for this." Richard disappeared from the room. The horse-drawn carriage departed from the Magus Tower and traveled through a small alleyway toward Rodu's renowned northern food district. "Master, wasn't that super awesome?" Amy asked as she turned to Crassus with an elated expression. "Little Amy, that chair smack just then was truly a masterpiece of mine." Crassus nodded with a smug expression as he stroked his beard. "TSK, I didn't learn that chair smack technique from Master." Amy shook her head. "You didn't learn it from me? Then who did you learn it from?" Crassus raised an eyebrow. "Did that old bastard Julian teach Amy melee magic?" Bam! Right at this moment, a dull thump erupted outside the carriage, and it abruptly came to a halt. "Did I hit you a little too hard?" Chapter 7:16. The horse-drawn carriage suddenly came to a halt as if it had crashed into something. Meg wrapped his arms around Amy and looked warily at the curtains of the carriage. From the sound of it, the horse-drawn carriage driver had already been knocked out, so he was most likely up to no good. "What's that sound?" Crassus' brows furrowed slightly. With Amy in Meg's arms, Ugly Duckling, which had been sprawled on the seat, was thrown off of the seat by inertia before rolling out of the carriage curtains. "It's big sister Irina," Amy exclaimed in surprise upon hearing the sound, and she immediately lifted the curtains of the carriage. "Irina?" Meg turned toward the curtains of the carriage. An elf in a white dress was standing in front of the horse-drawn carriage, and she was pinching Ugly Duckling, which had curled up into a ball and was trembling uncontrollably. She was inspecting it with a curious expression on her beautiful face. The warm autumn sun shone down on her, and it was as if a golden veil had been draped over her body. Her long silver hair was casually draped over her back, and it fluttered slightly in the autumn wind, making her look like a celestial maiden who had just descended from the heavens. There was a golden crescent moon on her glabella, and it added a hint of holiness to her appearance. She was like the first snowflake in winter, and the first drop of dew on a flower petal made Meg's heart skip a beat. Could this be the feeling of falling in love with someone? Meg raised his eyebrows slightly. Alex's memories didn't affect him in the slightest, and this was the first time that this beautiful elf had entered his world. She was like a wisp of spring wind that stirred up a river. Irina stared at Ugly Duckling for a while with a serious expression and said, "It's already as fat as a ball. If we stew it, it should be enough to fill a pot, right?" Amy hurriedly shook her head with a serious expression and said, No, we can't stew it yet. Big sister Irina, Ugly Duckling will grow into a swan in the future. I heard from Father that roast goose is super delicious." Irina looked at Ugly Duckling with a skeptical expression and said, "Is that so? This ball can grow into a swan? Is the roast goose really delicious?" Yes. Father said that the little match girl forgot to go home for dinner because she was too engrossed in watching the roast goose. As a result, she starved to death outside the roast goose restaurant. The roast goose must be very, very delicious. Amy nodded. Irina nodded thoughtfully. If that's the case, then let's keep it for a while longer. Amy took Ugly Duckling back from Irina and hugged it. Meow, meow, Ugly Duckling lowered its head and let out an aggrieved cry. Why did it have to endure such pressure at such a young age? Meg facepalmed. There was no need to doubt it. This was definitely his biological mother. Even their way of thinking was exactly the same. Little Irina, so it's really you. No wonder your voice sounded so familiar. Crassus wore a wide smile on his face as he winked at Irina. You were the one who beat up Brent in the Magus Tower, right? That's right, white-bearded old man. Long time no see. Irina nodded at Crassus. She clenched her fists and said, I beat up that damn fatty every time I see him. Now that we're in Rodu, I'm going to beat him up to make myself happy. I also think that beating up that damn fatty is very satisfying. That slap this morning really made me feel good. Crassus nodded in agreement. However, he then asked, but how do you know little Amy? Little Amy. Irina's eyes lit up. Her name was Amy, and her nickname was Amy. She had silver hair and blue eyes. Was this really just a coincidence? Meg looked at Irina, and countless ideas flashed through his mind. However, he just couldn't come up with a foolproof plan. Even Amy couldn't forget her mother, so it didn't take much for him to guess just how much Irina missed Amy. He really couldn't bear to let them miss each other again. Irina looked up at Meg, and there seemed to be light flashing in her bright blue eyes. She was trying to find the face of the person she had been thinking about day and night. This man with a mustache could be considered to be quite handsome, but his appearance was completely different from Alex's. Even his black eyes didn't resemble Alex's at all. Alex's eyes weren't like that. Eyes didn't lie. They were the windows to one's soul. The only thing that could be considered similar was their height. However, Alex was slightly more muscular. Is he really Alex? Or has he completely hidden himself in order to hide his identity? Countless questions flashed through Irina's mind, and she averted her gaze with difficulty. She looked at Crassus with a relaxed expression and said, Xiaomi and I didn't know each other until we fought. Xiaomi also helped me when I beat up that fatso. Amy nodded with elation. That's right, that's right. Look, Master Crassus, I didn't learn how to hit people with a chair from you. I learned it from Big Sister Irina. By the way, Big Sister Irina, did you knock out our coachman with a chair as well? Amy looked at the coachman lying on the ground, as well as the wooden splinters all over the ground, and asked with a confused expression, Well, I thought too highly of him. Irina looked at the coachman and stuck out her little tongue in an embarrassed manner. We're going to the Renha food street, but we don't have a coachman. What should we do now? Amy was a little concerned. Irina's eyes lit up. The food street? I want to go there as well, but I need someone to drive the coachman. Everyone then turned to Meg in unison. Irina looked at Meg, and she recalled the first time she had met Alex. She then ordered with a stern expression, I am the fairy princess Irina. I order you to be my coachman and take us to the Renha food street. I want to refuse this order, but why do I feel a sense of joy? Meg was suddenly struck by a series of complex emotions. He felt like these words were strangely familiar. Could it be that he had a fetish for queens? Or was he a masochist? No, it can't be like that. It has to be an S. Meg shook these strange thoughts out of his mind as he spread open his hands in a resigned manner. I'm a chef, not a coachman. So you don't want to be my coachman? Irina looked into Meg's eyes. Of course not. Father's coachman is very good. Hurry up and get in the car, Big Sister Irina. She nudged Mag's arm with her elbow and whispered into his ear, Father, no big sister will like you if you act like this. Mag nodded. Then, he turned to Mag and said, Father, no big sister will like you like this. Meg looked at Amy and opened his mouth, but he didn't know what to say. Chapter 717. So it really is you, Alex. Irina took a meaningful look at Meg before boarding the horse-drawn carriage and sitting beside Amy. She had heard the same answer 10 years ago, and it was still the same answer 10 years later. Aside from him, there was no one else. Mag lifted the unconscious coachman onto the horse-drawn carriage and said, "He can still be resuscitated. Can you revive him and make him faint? That way, he'll be able to take us back with him when we go back. Otherwise, it'll be difficult for us to explain ourselves." "Half dead? All right." Irina nodded before pointing a finger at the horse-drawn carriage driver. A speck of green light flew out from her fingertip before landing on the horse-drawn carriage driver's glabella. "That's a very interesting way to put it." Meg was a little speechless, but seeing as the horse-drawn carriage driver's complexion had returned to normal, he didn't say anything else. He kicked the sawdust off the ground and asked a passerby for the location of the Renha food street before slowly driving the horse-drawn carriage forward in a slightly unfamiliar manner. Meg's horse-riding skills were quite good, but this was his first time driving a horse-drawn carriage. Even though it was a little slow, he still managed to get the hang of it, and after gradually familiarizing himself with it, it was quite a smooth ride. However, as he sat outside, Meg's mind was completely focused on the carriage behind him. He still wasn't sure if Irina had already recognized him and Amy. Alex's memories of Irina had been completely erased, so he didn't even know what kind of person she was. From his current observations, he could tell that she was bold, had a unique way of thinking, was prone to violence, and had the demeanor of a queen. But none of that had much to do with her IQ. "Big sister Irina, you said you'd come to find me again, but I thought it would be a long time before you did. I didn't think you'd appear so soon." Amy looked at Irina with a joyful smile on her face. She then looked outside and whispered also, "I only told Father about you. He's also super excited to see you." "Really? I don't think he's showing it," Irina said doubtfully. Her voice was just loud enough for Meg, who was sitting outside, to hear. Meg blushed with shame. Amy was even trying to matchmake her parents. "It's true. It's just that Father's reaction is a little slow, but I'm sure he really likes you. He's very gentle with women," Amy quickly said with certainty. "You're gentle to all women?" Irina's voice suddenly became a little playful. Meg suddenly felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. He was afraid that Amy would say something she shouldn't. This was the first time he felt that women could be a little scary. "Not really." Amy shook her head. "That's more like it." Irina slowly loosened her clenched fists. "Who?" Meg couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. Fortunately, Amy knew what to say and what not to say. Amy paused for a moment before continuing. "Father is only gentle with teacher Luna, big sister Mia, big sister Aisha, big sister Gloria, big sister Vivian, big sister Anna. Looks like there are quite a lot of pretty big sisters." Irina's voice became a little dangerous, and the temperature in the car seemed to drop quite a bit. "Luna is Amy's teacher, Mia and Aisha are the restaurant's waitresses, Miss Gloria and Miss Vivian are the customers, and Anna is a 5-year-old elf that I saved before." Meg didn't know why he had to explain, but he felt that if he didn't, his life would be in danger. As a man, he felt that this wasn't because he was afraid of his wife, but because he respected women. He was a man who respected women's rights. "Yes, that must be it." "I see." Irina nodded non-committally, and the temperature in the car eased a little. Crassus, who had been silent all this time, interrupted. "I heard that Miss Gloria danced with Mr. Mac at the party, right? She doesn't seem to be an ordinary customer, right?" Meg suddenly had the urge to jump out of the car. "Looks like Mr. Mac is really popular with young ladies," Irina said with a smile, but she obviously emphasized the words, "young ladies." Amy looked at Irina in surprise. "Big sister Irina, how did you know?" "There are a lot of young ladies lining up at the restaurant's entrance every day, wanting to be the boss wife and have children for father." "Giddy up, giddy up, giddy up." Feeling the temperature gradually drop behind him, Meg waved the whip in his hand wildly. "I'm Meg, and now, I'm a little panicked." Irina withdrew her gaze from the car curtain and looked at Amy, who was sitting obediently beside her. She rested her chin on her hands and looked at her, feeling as if her heart was about to melt. This was the daughter she had been longing for. When she was born, she was just a little girl, and she was a little ugly. so she almost lost her. She didn't expect her to grow into such an adorable girl. It had been 3 years, and she even thought that they were really gone. She didn't expect that she could still sit beside her like this. How should I improve my relationship with her? Irina looked at Amy, feeling conflicted. Children were also very unfamiliar to her. She clumsily reached out to Amy, but halfway through, she awkwardly withdrew her hand and said in a commanding tone, "Amy, come into my arms." Am I too fierce? Shouldn't I be gentler? Will I scare her? As soon as she said that, Irina panicked and looked at Amy nervously. Really? Amy's eyes lit up, and she looked at Irina in disbelief. She almost couldn't believe her ears. The fairy sister, who was as beautiful as a goddess, was actually asking her to go into her arms? You don't want to? Irina opened her arms. She wanted to be gentler, but her words were still unquestionable. Of course I do. Amy nodded vigorously without even thinking. Looking at Irina's open arms, she hesitated for a moment, then carefully approached her and rested her face on her chest. It's so soft, so warm, so comfortable. Amy closed her eyes and opened her arms to hug Irina. There was a comforting fragrance on her body. It was like the fragrance of flowers, but it was more captivating than the fragrance of flowers. In this warm embrace, she felt as if she could fall asleep in an instant. If it was mother's embrace, it would definitely be this warm. Amy thought to herself, and a satisfied smile appeared on her face. Amy, my daughter, I've finally found you. Irina hugged Amy gently, feeling the warmth from the little girl in her arms. It was a wonderful feeling that connected the two of them, as if a ribbon had tied them together. She gradually calmed down from her initial discomfort and patted her gently on the back. What a wonderful feeling this was. Bam! Behind the rhinoceros carriage, there were a dozen armored knights with helmets on their heads. All of them sat on the backs of their horses with cold expressions. They had no intention of getting off the carriage. The location of the collision was at a T-junction near the food street. It was a place with a lot of people. The loud collision and the scene of the carriages moving sideways attracted the attention of many passers-by. The badges on the two carriages caused the passers-by to whisper to each other. Isn't that the first prince's obsidian rhino carriage? Don't tell me the emblem on the carriage belongs to the second prince? The first prince's carriage crashed into the second prince's carriage, and even the coachman was sent flying. This is big news. It's going to be His Majesty's birthday soon. The two princes aren't going to fight over this, are they? The violent swaying of the horse-drawn carriage also caused Amy, who was lying in Irina's arms, to raise her head with a perplexed expression as she asked in a quiet voice, "Huh? Was there a collision?" Bastard. How dare you interrupt Amy and I while we're improving our relationship? Irina wore a frosty expression. She had just embraced Amy in her arms and didn't even have the chance to properly bask in the warmth that she had missed for 4 years. Who would have thought that they would be interrupted like this? A general in a suit of black armor emerged from the rhinoceros carriage before making his way over to the horse-drawn carriage. He said in a solemn voice, "Is that a horse-drawn carriage from the second prince's manor? This obsidian rhino suddenly went berserk and crashed into your carriage. My apologies. May I know if anyone has been injured?" That's not how you apologize. Right at this moment, a cold voice sounded from within the horse-drawn carriage. A corner of the carriage's curtain fluttered slightly, and a figure appeared in front of the rhinoceros carriage with a chair in her hand. So beautiful. All of the passers-by's eyes lit up at the sight of the fairy who had suddenly appeared in front of the rhinoceros carriage. Her long silver hair fluttered in the wind, and she was like a celestial maiden who had descended from the heavens. No one was able to avert their eyes from her beauty, and they were all curious as to why she had suddenly appeared. Crap. The general and the horsemen behind the rhinoceros carriage were all startled by her sudden appearance. Her speed was simply astonishing, and she had appeared in front of the rhinoceros carriage in the blink of an eye. They didn't even see how she had appeared. Bam! A resounding boom erupted. The chair was shattered, sending wooden splinters flying through the air. The obsidian rhino, which had been raising its head with white vapor puffing out of its nostrils, fell to its knees as if it had been struck by a heavy hammer. Its horn, which was as hard as steel, had been flattened by the chair, and it fell to its knees in front of Irina, completely devoid of life. The rhinoceros carriage swayed slightly and almost flipped over. Everyone present reflexively swallowed involuntarily upon seeing this. Irina appeared to be extremely frail and feeble in front of the obsidian rhino, so the sight of her slamming the obsidian rhino to the ground with a chair was even more astonishing to everyone. This was a 5th-tier magic beast that was renowned for its defensive prowess. Even a 5th-tier knight would find it very difficult to defeat it, let alone slamming it to death with a wooden chair. Seeing as you can't even control a little rhino, I'll do it for you. Irina tossed the wooden chair leg in her hand onto the ground before turning to the general and the horseman with a cold expression. Don't release anything that you can't control in the future. Otherwise, I'll kill every single one of them that I see. You. One of the horsemen drew his longsword in an attempt to charge forward and arrest the disrespectful fairy. Are you insane? That's the elven princess we're talking about. The knight beside him grabbed his collar and almost pulled him down from the horse's back as he said with a nervous expression, The elven princess. The knight's voice trembled as he fell from his horse's back in shock. The Roth Empire's military had a list of 3 dantes to be messed with the number 1 being elven princess Irina. She had once traveled with Alex and had left behind many legends. She had once been regarded as the only candidate to become Alex's wife. Of course, that wasn't the reason why she couldn't be messed with. Instead, it was because everyone who had messed with her had been severely punished. For example, that obsidian rhino had suffered a relatively quick death. All of the horsemen didn't dare to do anything rash. Even the general who had just spoken wore an uneasy expression and didn't dare to step forward. Who would have thought that an elven princess would appear out of nowhere? The entire carriage fell extremely silent. Wow, Big Sister Irina is so awesome. Amy clapped her little hands with reverence on her little face. Chapter 719. A tall and broad figure emerged from the rhinoceros carriage. His suit of golden armor shimmered under the sun, making his chiseled features even more intimidating. He had a hand on the long sword hanging from his waist and was giving off a powerful aura as he appraised Irina calmly. He wasn't enraged in the slightest by her words. It really is him. Meg's eyes narrowed slightly, but he quickly returned to normal. This was the first prince who had once shared a cup of wine with Alex at the border, and he was also one of the instigators behind the incident 3 years ago. Everyone thought that Alex and the first prince were very close, so if the second prince were to vie for the throne, he would definitely side with the first prince. However, that was all in the past. After the soldiers on the border shed their disguises as normal people and gradually became the rising stars of the Roth Empire's military, the two of them gradually drifted apart due to their greed and power. It's His Highness. All of the passers-by extended respectful salutes at the sight of Sean emerging from the rhinoceros carriage. Ever since Alex's death, the invincible Sean had gradually replaced Alex's title as the God of War, becoming the new guardian of the Empire. Sean's status in the hearts of the common people was far inferior to Josh's, but during the past 2 to 3 years, he had won the hearts and minds of many of the common people, and he was already on par with Josh. He was undoubtedly one of the people who had benefited from Alex's death. Sean nodded at the passers-by with a smile on his face. Even though his aura was very powerful, it didn't make him seem all that distant and aloof. Looks like he's really gone crazy trying to become the king. He's even learned the superficial skills of a politician. Meg couldn't help but grumble internally. He couldn't be bothered to participate in the battle for the throne. Politics was too complicated, and he would rather be in the kitchen. However, he didn't like either of the 2 people who were going to vie for the throne. Whichever one of them became the king wasn't something to be happy about, so he was feeling rather conflicted. Furthermore, what was giving Meg a headache was Irina, who had rushed out and killed the obsidian rhinoceros with a chair. He had thought that she would keep a low profile, but it appeared that the word low profile didn't exist in her dictionary. Their family of 3 had gathered together in a horse-drawn carriage, and it had been crashed into by Sean, so it was very difficult for them not to arouse suspicion. Irina looked at Sean with a smile and said, "I like to beat the dog's owner. Of dog's owners, dogs loose, so I hope you can keep an eye on your dog's owner's personality. And you, of's owners, so I hope you'll be careful. Your Highness is right. I will tie up all the dogs at home when I go back." Sean still didn't appear to be enraged in the slightest. He turned to Mag with a smile and said, "However, I didn't think that your Highness would already be in Rendezvous, and that you would be riding on the second prince's horse-drawn carriage. May I know who you are? Is he an honored guest of yours?" Sean's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Meg, who was standing in front of the horse-drawn carriage. He had just received news the day before that Josh had found a chef by the name of Meg in Chaos City, and was going to invite him to cook for the king. Furthermore, that chef had a half-elf daughter who was around 3 or 4 years old. According to the latest news from the cheetahs, Bertley, who had been tailing Louis XIII, had gone missing in Chaos City. Coincidences like these were far too ingenious, and Sean couldn't help but want to try it out himself. Who would have thought that he would bump into Irina, a chef by the name of Meg and a half-elf daughter who was around 3 or 4 years old? They had just arrived in Chaos City, and Irina was riding in the same horse-drawn carriage as them? Was this really just a coincidence? That was far too much of a coincidence. Sean refused to believe that so many coincidences would coincide with the same person. Furthermore, that person was none other than Alex, whom he had been searching for this entire time. Meg's heart sank slightly upon hearing this. He had only just gotten past Josh, and now Sean had come knocking on his door. On top of that, he had dragged Irina into this as well. It was going to be very difficult for him to clear his name. After all, he couldn't display his culinary skills in public. Right at this moment, Crassus emerged from within the carriage and turned to Sean with a smile as he asked, "Would I count as an honored guest, Your Highness?" Crassus. Sean's pupils contracted upon hearing this. Irina was already enough to surprise him, but who would have thought that there would be a Crassus hidden in this tiny horse-drawn carriage? Sean's expression quickly returned to normal, and he smiled as he said, "So it's Master Crassus. Of course you're an honored guest. I heard that you went to Chaos City. I didn't think that you would also be in Rendezvous. Who is Master Crassus? Why is His Highness so respectful toward him? You don't even know who Master Crassus is? How dare you say that you're from the Roth Empire?" That's right. 50 years ago, Master Crassus was just like Master Alex a few years ago. He dominated the entire continent on his own, and even giant dragons had to transform into their human forms to enter Rendezvous. Otherwise, they would have been struck down from the sky. That's right. The current Magus Tower is only what it is today because of Master Crassus' illustrious achievements. Otherwise, how could it be taller than the royal palace? All of the passers-by began to discuss spiritedly among themselves upon hearing that. Some elderly people were very excited when they talked about Crassus' feats, and wanted nothing more than to rush up to Crassus to express their admiration for him. Crassus pursed his lips and said, "I'm not a tree. I have to stay wherever I grow. Sean, you haven't even become the king yet, and you're already trying to control where I go?" Sean's expression became even more cautious. Crassus had an extremely special status in the Roth Empire, and was not inferior to Alex's status in the past. He had severed his ties with the Magus Tower and left Chaos City, which was undoubtedly the equivalent of cutting off an arm of Josh's, and that made him extremely elated. However, he was now disembarking from Josh's horse-drawn carriage, and appeared to be in a very bad mood. If he were to stand on Josh's side again, that would clearly be unacceptable to him. "You're too kind, Master Crassus. I'm just concerned about you. There's no place on the Norland continent that you can't go to," Sean said with a smile. Crassus looked at Sean with a smile and said, "In that case, I've only just arrived in Rendezvous, so I'm taking my precious disciple out to eat some good food, and I'm also taking little Irina out for a chat. I don't think that's a problem for you, right? You don't have to use such a huge magic beast to kill me, do you?" Chapter 720. Sean apologized before departing, and Mag dragged the coachman back into the carriage. Then, he steered the horse-drawn carriage toward the food street, albeit with difficulty. Looks like it's inevitable that I'll be targeted by Sean. I'll just have to prove that I'm not Alex when I cook for the king tomorrow. Meg's heart was a little heavy. Sean wasn't as boorish as he appeared to be. Now that he had become suspicious, he would definitely keep an eye on him. The assassin that was tailing Louis XIII had already proven that he hadn't given up on searching for Alex, and he didn't want Alex to die any more than Joshua did. If Alex didn't die, then all of his efforts over the past 3 years would have been for naught, and the people's reverence for him would be transferred to Alex. There was only one god of war, and he had to be the most powerful one. Big Sister Irina, you're so awesome. You flattened such a huge bull with just a slap. Amy looked at Irina with admiration in her eyes. Irina was quite enjoying Amy's adoring gaze. It felt like being adored by one's own daughter was even more special. She waved her hand nonchalantly and said, "It was just a light slap. It's not worth mentioning." Crassus stroked his beard with a smile and said, "Little Amy, there's no need for you to be envious. Little Irina also learned melee magic from me for a period of time. Even though she's not my disciple, she's still half a senior to you. However, she wasn't proficient enough, so she didn't learn any of the truly powerful spells. When you grow up, you'll definitely be even more powerful than her." "Wow, white-bearded old man. I can't believe you're still hiding something from me. Back then, you told me that you were going to teach me everything you know. I can't believe you're hiding something even more powerful." Irina raised her beautiful eyebrows and glared at Crassus. Crassus shrugged, refusing to accept the blame. "Of course, I have to teach my disciple powerful magic. Besides, little Irina, you can't accuse me wrongly. Back then, when the elves interfered with you learning magic from me, I taught you all the magic that you could learn. You were far from being able to learn other magic at that time." Amy's eyes lit up. "So Big Sister Irina is actually my senior sister. That's great. If only I could be as good as Big Sister Irina in the future. Don't worry. Even if you're better than me, you might not be able to do it. But you're definitely better than most people. You're Irina's." Irina looked at Amy and paused for a moment. "Junior." Meg listened to the conversation in the carriage with a faint smile on his face. For some reason, he felt inexplicably happy. He parked the carriage in a small alley outside the food street. A carriage with the insignia of the second prince's residence was far too conspicuous, so it was impossible to keep a low profile. It was completely unlike Meg's usual style of doing things. "The food street is too crowded. Let's park the carriage here and walk there," Meg said with a smile as he lifted the curtain of the carriage. Okay. I want Father to hug me. I want you to lift me up high." Amy was the first to run out. She then opened her arms and pouted at Meg. "This is my man." Irina raised an eyebrow and turned to look at Meg. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she asked, "You dare to hug another woman? Okay, Father will hug you. Father will lift you up high." Meg smiled as he picked up Amy. He lifted her up above his head, then put her down. He lifted her up again, and then put her down again. So high. This is so fun." Amy called out happily. Her face was full of smiles. After lifting her up 5 or 6 times, Meg finally hugged Amy in his arms and kissed her forehead. He was in a great mood. He didn't just hug her. He even kissed her. Irina glared. However, when she looked at Amy, her gaze softened. She felt a little strange. It was as if hugging and kissing her daughter on the forehead wasn't something out of line. But why are they so intimate? Irina looked at Meg and Amy, who were beaming with smiles, and felt a little jealous. Meg didn't even look at her from start to finish. It was as if Amy was the only person in his eyes. "Big Sister Irina, what's wrong? Do you also want Father to hug you and lift you up high?" Amy turned to look at Irina and asked with concern. Then she patted Meg on the shoulder and whispered in his ear, "Father, your chance is here." Irina almost blurted out the word, "I want." However, when she looked at Meg, who was looking at her calmly as if she was a stranger, she paused and said, "I don't want to." Then she jumped out of the carriage. Meg raised his eyebrows. He was helpless against Amy, who was trying so hard to set him up with Irina. What kind of chance was this? You guys go eat first. I'm going to look for an old friend. I'll come back later, Crassus said with a smile as he got out of the carriage. Then he left with his magic caster's staff. There was no one else in the alley. Meg looked at Irina, and Irina looked back at Meg. The two of them stared at each other in silence, and the atmosphere seemed to have become a little awkward. After a long while of awkward silence, Amy asked in a quiet voice, "Do you two like each other?" Irina took Amy from her arms, then pointed at Ugly Duckling, which was squeaking feebly on the shaft of the carriage, and ordered, "I'll hold Amy, you hold it." "All right." Meg looked at Irina, who was holding Amy without any intention of negotiating, and picked up Ugly Duckling with a resigned expression. She wanted to hold her own child, so how could he stop her? Besides, even if he wanted to stop her, how could he? They weren't even on the same level as each other. He was like that obsidian rhinoceros, who could easily flatten a wooden chair with a swat. Most importantly, she was actually a magic caster. Hence, after a series of careful deductions, Meg decided to hold Ugly Duckling obediently. Regardless of when they reunited, it was clearly a good thing to allow Amy and Irina to interact and improve their relationship. However, he wasn't in the mood for the drama of a domineering princess falling in love with him just yet. He would marry a rich and beautiful woman, reach the pinnacle of his life, and become the most powerful man in this world. He would have the most beautiful woman in the world by his side, and be envied by all of the men in the world. That sounded like a wonderful idea, but when he thought about how he would only be able to hold Ugly Duckling at home every day and watch Amy and her mother being lovey-dovey, he simply couldn't imagine a life without any human rights. Since he had transmigrated to this world, even if he couldn't establish a harem and live a blissful life, he had to at least be a proper husband. No, I have to recover my powers as soon as possible. Meg made up his mind. Irina had only taken a few steps when she suddenly turned around to look at Meg. "You seem to be very displeased with me." Chapter 721. Amy turned to Meg with an anxious expression. Why would father say something like that? What if big sister Irina got upset? Irina had a playful look in her eyes, and a dangerous aura emanated from behind her smile. Meg could sense a frosty aura sweeping toward him, and he wanted to slap himself for jumping into such an obvious trap. He forced a smile onto his face and said, "No, I'm not displeased with you, Princess Amy. I'm very happy that you're treating Amy so well, even though you're of such high status. I'm just upset with myself for making the princess carry Amy, while I'm carrying an ugly duckling." "Is that really the case?" Irina looked into Meg's eyes. "Of course." Meg nodded with certainty. His gaze was firm and unwavering. "Alex has never lied to me. Even though I feel like he's changed a little, I don't think he'll lie to me." Irina withdrew her gaze and walked toward the alleyway with Amy in her arms. "Let's eat. I'm hungry." "Phew." Meg heaved a sigh of relief. He felt as if he had pulled his foot back from the jaws of death. "Good luck, father," Amy said soundlessly to Meg as she clenched her little fists to encourage him. Meg nodded and composed himself. He quickly followed along with Ugly Duckling in his arms. Even if it was to create a strong image of his father in front of Amy, he couldn't back down. After exiting the alleyway, a bustling and wide street appeared before the three of them. There were 2 or 3 stories tall European-style buildings on both sides of the street. They were mainly grayish-yellow in color, with domed roofs and stone pillars. There were also a series of restaurants situated on both sides of the street. There were also a series of small stalls on both sides of the street, where chefs from all over the world were displaying their skills. Sisi was bustling with activity as people passed through the stalls and restaurants. There were all kinds of delicious aromas wafting through the air, and it was like a river of delicious food. Meg looked at the bustling crowd on the Sisi street and couldn't help but exclaim internally, "It's not inferior to the modern gourmet street at all." However, there was a clear difference between the customers who wandered around the street stalls and the customers who went in and out of the high-end restaurants. The customers of the street stalls were obviously dressed shabbily. Most of them seemed to be ordinary civilians. It was rare to see someone who was dressed extravagantly. As for the customers entering and leaving the restaurant, most of them were dressed extravagantly. Carriages picked them up and dropped them off. It could be said that they were clearly separated. Meg wasn't too disgusted or cynical about this. After all, Mamie's had a higher threshold than the other restaurants on the street. However, almost the entire street was like this, and there were even restaurant doors that brazenly prohibited civilians from entering, which still made him frown. The political system of the Roth Empire was similar to that of England during the Middle Ages. However, after establishing the Roth Empire, the king of the Roth Empire adopted a policy of centralization of power. The nobles had the right to use their territory, but they didn't have the right to own it. This was similar to the national system in China during the Sui and Tang dynasties. This approach allowed the king to have a high degree of centralization of power, giving him the power to oversee the entire empire and ensuring that his policies and orders were carried out perfectly. However, the flaws of the feudal system were almost identical. The nobles didn't have the right to own any land, but they were still part of the upper class of the Roth Empire. They had many special privileges, and there was no equality between them and the commoners. The restaurant doors that blatantly prohibited civilians from entering was only a small part of this feudal empire. In the eyes of the nobles, commoners were nothing more than lowly beings who could be killed. Meg looked at the conspicuous sign on the door of a rotisserie by the name of Carrie's Rotisserie and clenched his fists as he thought to himself, I should tear down a sign like this and stick it on the owner's face. Compared to this city, he really did prefer Chaos City. At the very least, it gave him a sense of hope for equality. What do you want to eat? Irina asked in a nonchalant manner as she looked at Meg. I think. Meg withdrew his gaze and began to look around with a serious expression. Let's go to this rotisserie. Irina carried Amy over to the rotisserie next door. Meg looked at Irina's departing figure. She didn't need an answer from him at all. He quickly caught up to her and shrugged as he pointed at the sign on the door and said, I'm a commoner, not a noble. I also hate being called a noble, but as long as you're standing beside me, you're very important. Irina stopped in her tracks as she looked at Meg. This feeling of being a kept man really is awesome. Meg's eyes gradually widened as he raised an eyebrow. Meg tried his best to repress his urge to live off Irina and shook his head firmly as he said, I don't want to become a noble either. My restaurant should be more expensive than theirs, but I've never restricted who comes to eat there. Rip. Irina stared at Meg for a while before tearing down the sign on the door and tossing it aside as she asked, Are you happy now? I'm getting a little flustered. Meg looked at the sign on the ground, then at Irina's calm expression, and was momentarily at a loss for words. Irina's act of tearing down the sign on the door of Carrie's rotisserie immediately attracted the attention of many people. The beautiful and holy Irina was breathtaking, while the little half-elf girl in her arms was adorable and adorable. They were like a pair of jade statues, and no one was able to look away from them. Everyone then followed the gazes of Irina and the little half-elf girl to Meg, who was standing off to the side with Ugly Duckling in his arms, and peculiar looks immediately appeared on everyone's faces. He's clearly a lucky bastard. He's a grown man, but he's holding a kitten. That's right. Look at how cute that little girl is. If he didn't find a beautiful wife, would he have been able to give birth to her? That's right. What a beautiful flower, stuck in a pile of cow dung. As Meg listened to those sour words, he felt inexplicably good. It was just like in his previous life when he saw those anti-fans continuously spamming his Weibo. If you didn't have a good father, you would be nothing. If you didn't have good reincarnation skills, which internet celebrity would fancy you? If you didn't. Now that he thought about it, he really did miss it. He liked this feeling of jealousy and envy when everyone was unhappy with him, but they still had to watch from the side. Reincarnation was a skill, so how could he be blamed? Look at how good his craftsmanship is. He has drawn the best lot twice. There was no solution. Chapter 722. Carrie's rotisserie was quite renowned on the Renha food street, and it was renowned as the #1 rotisserie on the food street. Apparently, the true owner of this rotisserie was a duke with an extremely lofty status. Furthermore, the rotisserie had a rule that it only served nobles with noble titles, not commoners. Even so, there was still an endless stream of customers coming to the rotisserie every day just to taste the renowned grilled meat on the iron plate. Rodu was filled with nobles, and a single brick could easily knock over 5 or 6 viscounts. As such, the popularity of Carrie's rotisserie was extremely high. Ike stood at the entrance with a disdainful expression on his face as he looked around. As the head chef of Carrie's rotisserie, he had seen an entire table of dukes, yet someone dared to tear down the sign of his rotisserie. This was an absolute humiliation to him. His gaze fell upon Irina, and he was slightly taken aback. This elf who was hugging a little half-elf girl was simply too beautiful. Furthermore, according to his many years of experience, this elf's attire and disposition were definitely not that of an ordinary elf. Following the war among species, the relationship between the elven race and the human race had become one of the more harmonious races. There had never been any battles on the border, and the two races had only set up some symbolic sentries along the border without deploying any troops. As for intermarriage between humans and elves, even though it was still quite unpopular, it wasn't completely unheard of, and there were even some high-ranking nobles among those who did. Of course, the most renowned among them was naturally General Alex and Princess Irina, who had appeared as a couple several years ago. A man who's able to marry such a beautiful elf as his wife must be no ordinary man. Ike made a judgment in his heart as he turned to Mag. Meg was wearing an ordinary black robe that didn't appear to be extravagant in the slightest, and Ike's brows furrowed slightly upon seeing this. Is this guy a coachman? He doesn't look like a man who could have such an adorable child at all. Well, that's awkward. Tearing down the sign is going to ruin everything. Meg glanced at the sign on the ground before turning to Ike. There were so many people looking at them, and if Irina were to reveal her identity, news of Irina meeting a man with a half-elf girl in her arms and having a child out of wedlock would most likely spread throughout the entire Rodu. Everyone loved to gossip about princesses, and it wouldn't be a big deal if others were to hear about it. But if someone were to hear about it, they would immediately suspect him. Ding. System random mission. Host, please set up a stall and make it the most popular stall on the entire street within half a day. Mission reward. A recipe for stinky tofu. Mission failure punishment. Physical strength -1. Right at this moment, the system's voice suddenly sounded in Mag's mind. System? What are you doing? Do you think it's that easy to become the king of roadside stalls? Mag raised an eyebrow. He hadn't thought of a solution yet, but the system had already appeared and even issued such a strange mission. He had a good impression of roadside stalls. In his previous life, he had often bought skewers from roadside stalls. As long as the ingredients were clean and the taste wasn't bad, he would give it a try. However, it was very difficult for roadside stalls to survive if they didn't have some skills, let alone become popular. All of the roadside stalls on Rodu's most popular food street were doing quite well, and with the rental fees, they would most likely close down in just a few days if they didn't have some skills. Meg didn't have a stall, and he didn't have any cooking utensils or ingredients with him, so the system was clearly toying with him. Host, you're the man who's going to become the god of cookery. If you can't even solve a problem like this, how are you going to shoulder such a heavy burden? Go ahead, you'll have to start by becoming the king of roadside stalls. The system said with perfect articulation. I'll ask you again, who tore down my sign? Ike asked in a loud voice as he turned to Meg. That man isn't going to make that beautiful elf suffer the consequences, is he? All of the passers-by looked at the dazed Meg with displeasure in their hearts. What a beautiful flower. Irina looked at Ike with an honest expression as she said, It was me, because I think your sign is very insulting to us commoners. As a commoner chef, I believe that food can be measured by money, but it shouldn't be eaten by people of different social classes. Meg cut off Irina's words as he took 2 steps forward and sniffed toward the rotisserie. He then turned to Ike with a perplexed expression as he asked, Also, do you think only nobles deserve to eat ordinary rotisserie? Who gave you the confidence to do that? Irina turned to Meg with a hint of surprise on her face. He hadn't been so good with words in the past, but after thinking about it, she could roughly guess why Meg didn't want her to mention his name, so she didn't say anything further. So he's not a couple with that beautiful elf. As expected, he's a lot more pleasing to the eye now. I'm so happy to hear that. Every time he passed by this barbecue restaurant, he saw the notice hanging on the door and wanted to tear it down. I don't want to eat that rotisserie. Who would have thought that he's also a chef? However, Carrie's Rotisserie is renowned for its rotisserie, and it's one of the top 3 rotisserie restaurants in Rodu. How can this guy say that his rotisserie is ordinary? Could it be that he can cook even better rotisserie? All of the passers-by turned to look at Meg upon hearing that. They had thought that he was just a gigolo hiding behind his beautiful wife, but who would have thought that he would stand up for himself? He wasn't backing down in the slightest, and his words made all of the commoners feel as if they had vented their frustrations. This is so fucking satisfying. I feel like I've vented all of my frustrations over the past few days. There was a barbecue stall in front of Carrie's Rotisserie, and the owner of the stall, Sinclair, was looking at Meg with an elated expression. He had already taken over this stall for half a month, and he wanted to make a big splash. However, he didn't think that the rotisserie that was so popular at home would be so unpopular on the food street. On top of that, he was constantly being mocked by the owner of Carrie's Rotisserie, as well as his employees. The owner and employees of Carrie's Rotisserie were all extremely haughty and arrogant, just because all of the customers were nobles. Ike was so enraged that he burst into laughter as he pointed his knife at Meg. You little brat. How dare you criticize Carrie's Rotisserie like that? Aren't you afraid of getting into trouble? You know, even Duke Abraham said that my barbecued meat was good after tasting it. Who do you think you are? Chapter 7:23. You're saying that Crassus has also come to Rodu, and he took his disciple to the Magus Tower to defeat Kola? Furthermore, Irina also beat Bryn up in the Magus Tower at the same time? Within a unicorn carriage that had just sped out of the royal palace, Josh's brows furrowed slightly as he looked at the magic caster sitting across from him. The magic caster nodded respectfully and replied, "That's right, Your Highness. The president is more concerned about whether Princess Irina will continue to attack the Magus Tower. When the time comes, the Magus Tower will retaliate." Josh's expression remained calm as he said, "I'll go and meet Irina in person. Tell the president to rest assured that she most likely won't attack the Magus Tower again. As for Crassus, if the president can mend his relationship with him and get him to stand on our side, then that would naturally be a good thing. His disciple is currently living in my manor, so I'll be sure to push for that. Please apologize to the president on my behalf." "All right, I'll report to the president right away." The black-robed magic caster nodded, and the horse-drawn carriage stopped at the entrance of an alleyway before disappearing from sight in the blink of an eye. The horse-drawn carriage continued onward, and Josh's brows furrowed tightly as he murmured to himself, "Is it just a coincidence that they appeared there at the same time? She's not even 4 years old, yet she was able to defeat Kola with ease. Such aptitude and power are hard to come by even once in 1,000 years. If Meg isn't Alex, then could that little girl be their daughter? Your Highness, we've lost contact with the 2 cheetah members who were tailing them. Should we send more people to track them down?" Quinn asked in a quiet voice as he appeared in a private room on the 2nd floor of a restaurant. Sean shook his head in response. "There's no need for that. As long as Crassus doesn't want to, no one will be able to keep an eye on him." Quinn continued, "I just received some information about Crassus. 2 months ago, he took in a half-elf disciple who's around 3 years old in Chaos City. That disciple's father is the owner of a restaurant by the name of Amy's. According to the latest news from the Mage Tower, Crassus brought his disciple to the Mage Tower and defeated Richard's disciple. Brent was attacked by an unknown person in the Magus Tower and was severely injured." Sean made his way over to the window with a smile and said, "Josh invited the father of Crassus' disciple to cook for the king, but Crassus and his disciple wreaked havoc in the Magus Tower. If I'm not mistaken, the mysterious person who beat up Brent was most likely Irina. After that, She reunited with Crassus and the others before boarding the same horse-drawn carriage as the second prince's manor. To put it simply, did Joshua find someone to slap the face of the Magus Tower? Could it be? There's already a rift between Joshua and the Magus Tower? Is that why he hired someone to attack the Magus Tower? Quinn was rather surprised to hear this. Sean shook his head and said, if it were someone else, that would be a possibility. However, Crassus and Irina are not people who can be bribed, so it's most likely that even Joshua himself didn't expect something like this to happen. However, this is undoubtedly a good thing for us. If we can get the spy in the Magus Tower to instigate this, it'll be a good thing for us as long as we can create a rift between Joshua and the Magus Tower. Yes, Quinn replied in a respectful manner before departing. Regardless of whether you're Alex or not, perhaps we're on the same side again this time. Sean picked up a glass of wine from the table and downed it in one gulp. In the face of Meg's question, Sinclair only faltered for a second before nodding without any hesitation. It's a deal. You can use all of the ingredients and kitchenware for free as long as you pay the cost of the ingredients. If necessary, I can even be your assistant. Meg looked at Sinclair, who had only taken 3 seconds to put the apron on Sinclair and shove a boning knife into his hand. The bearded man was more enthusiastic than he had expected, and he nodded with a smile as he said, "Thank you. If it's possible, I'll need you to help me collect the money. I'll pay you double the salary of a cashier." "It's my pleasure, sir," Sinclair replied with a smile. Cindy said with a smile. Out of nowhere, she pulled out an apron with the word cashier written on it and put it on. Sinclair could sense Meg's peculiar gaze, and an awkward smile appeared on his face as he said, "I had prepared this because I thought business would be booming, but I haven't had the chance to use it yet." "Very good." Meg nodded with a smile. This temporary employee was quite interesting. Ike chuckled coldly as he looked at Mag and said, "Do you think a simple roadside stall can prove anything? People with real status would never stoop so low as to eat from a roadside stall like yours. A chef like you is only fit to stand on the side of the road for the rest of your life, cooking low-class barbecue for commoners. Barbecue doesn't become noble just because of who eats it." Mag looked at Ike with a calm expression and said, "How about we make a bet? I'll spend half a day cooking roast meat here, and let's see if my humble roadside stall attracts more customers during that time, or if your self-proclaimed high-class rotisserie is going to attract more customers. If you lose, you're not allowed to put up this sign in the future, and if I lose, you can do whatever you want with me." "You said it yourself." Ike glared at Meg, and countless ways to punish Meg had already appeared in his mind. His restaurant was the most popular barbecue stall on the food street, and over 1,000 customers were served every day. How dare he challenge Carrie by renting a small roadside stall? What a fool. In order to protect Carrie's reputation, he had no choice but to accept this bet. Of course, what he wanted to do more than anything else was to grind Carrie's disgusting face into the ground. Meg nodded and said, "Very good, then let's begin now. Find a worker to keep an eye on my stall and record the number of customers. I'll keep track of all the customers who enter and leave your restaurant." "You're going to cry." Ike harumphed coldly before entering the barbecue stall. Soon, a worker came out and stood beside the stall, looking down at Meg and Sinclair with his nostrils. Sinclair approached Meg and whispered, "Aren't you being a little too harsh on yourself, sir? If you want to leave now, I can cover for you. I'm going to be super busy in a while. I hope you're good at math." Meg patted Sinclair on the shoulder with a smile. "By the way, you can call me Mr. Mac. Can you find me some paper and a pen?" "Paper and a pen? I just bought a new one for my daughter today." Sinclair rummaged under the cart for a while and pulled out a stack of white paper and a quill. "Thank you." Meg accepted the pen and paper, dipped it in ink, and began to write on the paper. Soon, a piece of paper was pasted onto the original sign of the barbecue stall. Chapter 724. He's trying to compete with Carrie's rotisserie, which is so popular that it has almost no business at all? Is he dreaming? Could it be that the owner of this stall bribed someone? Is he trying to use this to hype up his own rotisserie? You don't say. that's actually a possibility. Otherwise, why would an idiot do something like this? Even though I like what this guy is saying, isn't he just throwing an egg at a rock? Roast beef for 1 silver coin per cube? Since when was beef sold by cubes? Amy's? How come I've never heard of this restaurant? Could it be that they're trying to hype up this restaurant? All of the passers-by and nearby stall owners were discussing quietly among themselves as they looked at Meg's new signboard. It was quite clear that not many people were optimistic that Meg would be able to make a comeback. Alex is going to set up a stall to sell roast beef? Is it edible? Irina looked at Meg with a skeptical expression. Back in the day, Alex had even eaten all of the food that she cooked, and the only thing that he didn't eat when it came to cooking was raw meat. But now, he was going to rent this stall and make a bet with someone else. Was he going to do better than the stall owner in a single afternoon? Big sister Irina, Father is going to set up a stall. Let's be the first customers. Father's roast beef kebabs are super delicious. Amy's eyes lit up, and she got down from Irina's arms before leading her over to the outdoor table beside the stall. Father really is smart. As long as I eat his delicious food, big sister Irina will definitely fall in love with him. You won't die from eating it, right? Irina was still skeptical. After all, Alex was someone who could eat so much roast chicken that she threw up. Of course not. Amy shook her head with a confident expression. It really is super delicious. All right, I believe in Amy. Irina smiled as she stroked Amy's hair and sat down on a stool with Amy. Sinclair looked at Meg's new signboard and asked suspiciously, Mr. Mac, did you write the wrong signboard? This is a piece of beef, right? How can you describe it as a grain? That's right, there's only one. It's about this size. Meg made a circle with his index finger and thumb as he continued to inspect the ingredients that Sinclair had prepared. There were 2 large pieces of ordinary beef tenderloin. The freshness of the tenderloin was not bad. It should have just been slaughtered in the morning. There were ice cubes underneath. The stall was using a charcoal grill and a long barbecue rack. Beside it were palm-sized slices of steak, which should be the barbecue meat that Sinclair was selling. As for the seasoning, Meg looked around and found only salt. What a Buddhist-style barbecue. It doesn't even have any oil. Is it dry roast beef? It's no wonder that business is so good. Meg couldn't help but grumble in his mind. This was a lean beef tenderloin. If it were beef tenderloin, there would at least be some oil. System, I don't want anything else. Give me a bottle of cumin and a bottle of black pepper. Meg was a little speechless as he closed the condiment box. Host, this mission. If you're not selling, then I'll double the price and have someone else buy it for me. Meg calmly interrupted the system. The system is at your service. A bottle of cumin and a bottle of black pepper have been delivered. Double the price has been successfully deducted. Please specify where to receive the goods. The system's cheerful voice sounded. Holy fuck. Did I agree to double the price? Meg raised an eyebrow. I'll double the price and have someone else buy it for me. I'll double the price and have someone else. A voice recording played in Meg's mind on a loop. The system will provide you with the best service. The system's voice seemed to have a face behind it with a professional fake smile. You're fucking awesome. Meg was feeling a little conflicted. As expected, when the system was shameless, even he had to back down a little. Is it this big? Are you sure? Sinclair pressed his eyes closer to the small circle and looked at Meg through it with an incredulous expression. How could someone be willing to buy a single cube of beef of this size? Furthermore, each cube cost a silver coin, while his entire steak was only selling for 20 copper coins. Meg waved the toothpick container next to him and looked at Sinclair. Yes, Mr. Sinclair. If you have time, can you help me buy a bucket of high-quality rapeseed oil and 10 toothpicks from other vendors? Toothpicks? Is Mr. Mac worried that customers will need to pick their teeth after eating beef? Don't worry. According to my experience, customers rarely ask for toothpicks. These toothpicks are enough. Sinclair shook his head with a smile. No, the toothpicks are for skewers of meat. Meg shook his head and looked at Sinclair with a serious expression. It's getting late. If Mr. Sinclair is willing to work for me for half a day, I hope you can ask fewer questions. Otherwise, I'll change my staff. As expected, Meg still preferred Yabamiya and Sally, who were quick on their feet and didn't talk much. This bearded man was a little too active and wasn't a good employee. Sinclair looked at Meg's serious expression and hesitated for a moment. Even though he had a lot of questions to ask, he swallowed them all and nodded. "Okay, Mr. Mack." He then immediately turned around and walked to the stall next door. Even though he had already decided to sell this stall and announced that his business had failed, he still wasn't willing to give up. If he could slap Carrie's rotisserie in the face before he left, then he would be very happy. Now, he just had to see if this Mr. Mack really had the ability to do so. Meg pulled out 2 bottles of seasoning powder from the cart. After his last experience, Meg no longer trusted the system to transfer things into his pocket. Irina was watching from the side. "Looks like we'll have to eat my roast meat for lunch today." Meg looked at Irina and Amy with a smile. "Don't worry, I'll eat Father's roast beef 10,000 times. Amy raised her little hand and yelled. Irina looked at Meg with a serious expression and said, "I hope I'll be able to make it to the next restaurant alive after eating it. I think you'll like it." Meg smiled as he turned around and began to prepare the beef. It appeared that Alex's cooking skills were even worse than he had imagined. All of the beef was cut into 2-centimeter cubes by Meg. There were 2 large cubes of beef, so there were over 1,000 cubes in total. After that, Meg went to a few other stalls and bought some seasoning powder from the stall owners. After that, he placed all of the cubes of beef into a large basin for further research. Due to the limitations of ingredients and time, Meg naturally couldn't make beef kebabs of the same standard as the ones he had made in the restaurant. However, at 1 silver coin per kebab, it was still worth it. His goal for the afternoon was to sell all of the beef he had. "I almost forgot." Meg suddenly slapped his own forehead as he took out a pen and scribbled a few words on the notice. Chapter 725. Half an hour later, Meg sat off to the side playing with Amy and Ugly Duckling, as if he had already forgotten about the bet. Irina sat off to the side with an appraising look on her face as she looked at Meg, who had made even Amy giggle. This man seemed to be completely different from the man in her memories. It was as if there were countless secrets about him that she was unaware of. What had happened to him in the past 3 years? How had he changed during the 3 years that they hadn't been together? Most importantly, was the food he cooked really edible? A series of questions surfaced in Irina's mind as she looked at Meg with curiosity in her heart. If this were the old Alex, he definitely wouldn't be able to tell such interesting stories, make funny faces to make their daughter laugh, and cook. This was a very peculiar feeling. He had once been the closest person to her, but now, she felt as if she were looking at a complete stranger. Getting to know him again seemed to be a very interesting process. The family of 3 was in no hurry, but Sinclair was like an ant on a hot tin roof. If it weren't for the fact that he had just been warned by Meg, he would have reminded him that they were still in the middle of a bet, and that he couldn't give up before the competition had even begun. He was quite amazed by Meg's knife skills. He was able to slice over 1,000 cubes of beef to the exact same degree, and that was a testament to his ability. However, he was rather perplexed by the sight of him mixing the beef into a bowl with a bunch of condiments. Was the beef still edible after being roasted with so many condiments? Wouldn't the beef's original flavor be completely gone? Sinclair's heart throbbed at the sight of the notice plastered on the cart. Not only was the beef being sold by the cubes, but there was also a limit on the number of cubes that each person could buy. That wouldn't even be enough to fill the gaps between his teeth. Many of the onlookers had already left, and some of the customers who had come up to ask about the stall were all turned away by Meg's excuse that it wasn't ready to open for business yet. Who would be bored enough to wait for a single cube of roast beef to open for business? The only ones who could attract the attention of passers-by were Amy and Irina, who were sitting behind the stall. This bet had spread to many stalls on the gourmet street, but there weren't many who supported Meg. Instead, many merchants were worried that Meg had broken the rules, and were worried that it would affect other people's stalls. In the kitchen of Carrie's rotisserie, Ike listened to the waiter's report, and a cold smile appeared on his face as he said, "Heh, I'll teach you a lesson at 5 o'clock. Head chef, count me in." A fat chef with a rolling pin in his hand joined in the fun. "All right." Later, If you have any resentment in your heart, follow me out. Let's fight until you feel comfortable. Ike waved his hand, which made the other chefs respond. Sinclair looked around before catching sight of the watch on Meg's wrist. He was a little surprised that Meg was able to afford such a small and intricate magic watch, but his eyes also lit up as he made his way over to Meg and asked in a quiet voice, "Mr. Mac, can you tell me what time it is?" "It's almost 12 o'clock. We've been marinating it for half an hour, so it's about time." Meg glanced at his watch before rising to his feet and making his way over to his stall. He was quite amused as he naturally knew what Sinclair was thinking. Half an hour of marinating time was still too short, but if he didn't start now, then it would be too late. "Good luck." Sinclair clenched his fists as he encouraged his son. "Boss Sinclair, this isn't very suitable for you." Meg looked at Sinclair with a complex expression. "Good luck, father. Good luck." Amy clenched her little fists as she yelled in a baby voice, "See, this is the standard version." Meg looked at Amy with a smile on his face. As expected, Amy was much more pleasing to the eye. "This world only cares about looks, but it can't see my interesting soul. Instead, it chose a beautiful body," Sinclair lamented with a pained expression. "A beautiful body is cute and adorable, but an interesting soul is a face full of beard. This is a test, so there's no need to choose." Meg calmly added charcoal into the oven. "Mr. Mac, you're so cruel." Sinclair clasped a hand over his heart. "This isn't suitable for you either." Sinclair wore a serious expression as he said, "I've given you everything, so I hope you won't let me down. Isn't it just a roadside stall that's on the verge of closing down? I bought back your beef, so you're not going to make any losses today. On top of that, I'll also give you a temporary job as a cashier with double the salary. You should be thanking me." Meg shrugged. "Mr. Mac, don't be like that. I didn't go to any lakeside, and I didn't do anything to you. Now, please shut up." Meg glanced at Sinclair and didn't realize that this guy was quite good at acting. "All right." Sinclair retracted his expression and stood expressionlessly beside the cart. After finally calming down, Meg tested the temperature with his hands before placing a piece of beef onto the barbed wire grill. As soon as the beef came into contact with the hot grill, a sizzling sound immediately rang out. Meg held a brush in his left hand and quickly brushed a layer of oil onto each piece of beef. Soon, the aroma of the beef wafted through the air. "So he's finally starting to grill the beef? This beef is really sliced into cubes? He's selling these tiny cubes for 1 silver coin? This boss must be crazy for money, right? I've seen beef sliced and grilled, but I've never seen beef sliced into cubes before. What's more, he's only selling 1 cube. Carrie's rotisserie's beef really is delicious." All of the customers are nobles, and even earls are often seen there. How can a roadside stall like this compare? All of the passers-by and stall owners immediately began to discuss spiritedly among themselves at the sight of Meg. Can he really make delicious beef like this? Sinclair stared at Meg with a skeptical expression, and he swallowed his words on several occasions. In any case, no one would eat his roast beef anyway, so he knew that he wasn't going to be able to do that. "Write a note for each customer, and I'll keep an eye on them." Meg took the opportunity to hand a pen and paper over to the employee from Carrie's rotisserie, who was on the verge of falling asleep. "Do you need it? I don't think you'll even get a single customer," the employee said in a disdainful manner as he appraised Meg with a disdainful expression. Meg slapped the pen and paper onto the employee's face with a smile and said, "I'm afraid that with your IQ, you'll make a mistake when there are so many customers." The employee was jolted awake by Meg's slap, and his eyes were filled with rage as he clasped a hand over his reddened face. "You've become a little more talkative, but your personality is still the same, right?" Irina silently put down the chair in her hand. "This is a bet between me and your boss. You won't be able to afford the consequences if you ruin it." Meg pursed his lips as he picked up some cumin and black pepper powder. "I saved your life, you idiot. Even a 5th-tier magic beast would be killed by that chair. When you lose, I'll show you what cruelty is." The employee gritted his teeth as he gripped onto the pen and paper in his hand tightly. The beef sizzled on the grill, and its aroma was already beginning to spread through the air. The cumin and black pepper powder were sprinkled evenly over the beef, and it was like a miraculous catalyst that instantly transformed the mild beef aroma into a delectable barbecue aroma that proliferated in all directions like a delicious bomb. This aroma. Chapter 726. If one wanted to stand out from the crowd of roadside stalls, a unique and fragrant aroma was clearly a very good trump card, as it would make all of the customers around them curious about what they were selling. To the people of Rodu, roast meat wasn't a very rare delicacy, but the aroma of this roast meat immediately attracted the attention of everyone around them. This was the aroma of roast meat, but it wasn't the aroma of ordinary roast meat. It was very difficult to imagine that roast meat could exude such a delectable aroma. Even Carrie's rotisserie didn't have such an alluring aroma. Everyone turned toward Meg's stall and craned their necks to see what he had added to his roast meat. They're clearly roasting the same piece of beef, so how could there be such a huge difference in the aroma? This is incredible. Sinclair stood off to the side with wide eyes as he stared at the sizzling pieces of beef on the grill with incredulity etched on his face. He had thought that his roast meat was already quite good, but after seeing Meg's roast meat, he was suddenly struck by a sense of wonder. His roast meat was simply rotten. The waiter from Carrie's rotisserie swallowed his saliva as he pursed his lips and said, "Even though it smells good, it's definitely nowhere near as delicious as Chef Ike's roast meat. Besides, there's only one chef in this tiny stall. How could he possibly be able to serve as many customers as Carrie's rotisserie? It smells so good. Is this really roast meat?" Irina took a whiff of the aroma, and her eyes lit up as she looked at Meg's departing figure with a peculiar expression. Could it be that he really has learned how to cook? Father really is a super good cook. If big sister Irina joins our family, we'll be able to eat Father's cooking every day, Amy said with a seductive expression as she looked at Irina. Irina looked at Amy with an exasperated smile as she said, "Little girl, do you want to introduce all of the pretty big sisters to your father?" Amy shook her head with a serious expression as she replied, "No, I don't. I think only big sister Irina is worthy of Father. I've never introduced any big sisters to Father before." Really? Irina was a little skeptical. Really? Amy nodded, her big blue eyes full of calmness. "What about your mother? Did your father tell you about it?" Irina asked in a low voice. "Father said that Mother is on the moon. Every night, I can see the moon just like Mother." Amy pointed to the sky and looked at Irina with a smile. "I think my mother must be as beautiful as big sister Irina. Father is usually too lonely by himself, so I wanted to introduce him to you. Father is really super nice. What a good child." Irina looked at Amy. The little girl was so well behaved that her heart ached for her. She reached out and gently stroked her hair, saying gently, "Your mother must be very beautiful. She must be very happy to see that you've grown up. It won't be long before she comes to see you." Amy's eyes lit up. She looked at Irina and said in surprise, "Really? Big sister Irina, could it be that you know my mother?" "That's right. Your mother is the most beautiful elf in the entire elf tribe. Of course I know her. She's also super powerful. There aren't many people in this city who can defeat her." Irina nodded proudly. "Wow, so Mother is so powerful." Amy's eyes were sparkling, and her little face was full of admiration. "Yes, she's very powerful, so she'll come to your side sooner or later." Irina nodded with a smile. She then looked at Meg's back and said, "So, what you have to do now is keep a close eye on your father. Don't let other women get close to him with strange intentions. Otherwise, when your mother comes back, he might be beaten to death." "Is she that scary? Father might not be able to defeat Mother." Amy's eyes widened, as if she had already sensed the severity of the situation. She nodded earnestly and said, "All right, I'll keep a close eye on Father and chase away all the women with ulterior motives." That's good." Irina nodded with satisfaction. "But big sister Irina, what do you mean by ulterior motives?" Amy asked with a perplexed expression. Irina looked at Amy, but she didn't know how to explain it. You mean those women who say things like, Mr. Mac, I want to have your babies. Mr. Mac, I want to marry you. And Mr. Mac, give me another bowl of tofu pudding, and I'll warm your bed? Amy asked again. Irina's eyes narrowed slightly, and a dangerous aura surged within them. It seemed that things were worse than she had imagined. Were these women trying to get themselves killed? These women should be given a fireball to teach them what shame is, Irina said with clenched fists. But if I do that, I'll have to burn a lot of people to death every day, and Father won't be happy. Amy jabbed her fingers together with a conflicted expression. But is he really that popular with women? This piece of wood? Irina looked at Meg with a skeptical expression. It was a completely unfamiliar side profile, and the contours of his face were softer than those of Alex's. The way he was focused on roasting meat made her lose focus for a moment. His appearance was rather similar to when he was practicing swordsmanship all those years ago. But now, he was using this focus on cooking. She could no longer sense any powerful energy fluctuations from his body. In fact, she felt that he was very frail. Even though he had survived the ambush 3 years ago, she was very pleased that he was able to recover to his current state after having his limbs and meridians crippled. Let me protect you from now on, Alex, Irina said with a slightly entranced expression. Meg made his way over to Irina with a plate of roast meat, and he placed it in front of her with a smile as he said, Have a taste of this freshly roasted beef. See if it's to your liking. The freshly roasted beef was still sizzling with oil, and the aroma of beef and black pepper wafted toward them. There was a bamboo skewer protruding from each of the 2-centimeter cubes of beef, and the entire plate was filled to the brim with meat. The aroma is so alluring, but I wonder how it tastes. It looks very delicious, but it's a little expensive to charge a silver coin for just one small piece of beef. Indeed, it's not even cheaper than the roast meat from Carrie's rotisserie. Everyone at the roast meat stall was discussing quietly among themselves as they looked at the roast meat placed in front of Irina and Amy. Chapter 727. Amy's face was full of joy as she ate the roast beef. After swallowing the beef, she stuck out her little pink tongue to lick the sauce on her lips, and a sweet smile appeared on her face. I'll risk my life to taste Alex's roast beef. Irina glanced at the smiling Meg before picking up a piece of beef with a bamboo skewer. The aroma of the roast beef wafted into her nose, and it was even more intense than the roast beef made with bean sprouts. The sauce had been applied very evenly, and the surface of the roast meat glistened with a faint oily sheen. It looked very delicate. She gently blew on the hot air before taking a bite. This taste is incredible. Irina's face immediately lit up. The slightly charred skin and the garlic-flavored sauce melted in her mouth as soon as the beef entered her mouth. The usual pungent garlic flavor was particularly gentle and delicious at this moment, and it made her mouth water. After chewing carefully, the tender beef melted in her mouth, and the aroma of garlic and meat wafted out from the meat. The deliciousness instantly blossomed in her mouth, and she could feel her taste buds cheering with every bite. It was impossible to stop. Phew! This beef is so delicious, I almost chewed my own tongue. It's incredible. I can't believe there's someone in this world who can make such delicious beef. And this person is Alex. Irina looked at Meg with amazement in her eyes. However, she only hesitated for a short while because she couldn't help but pick up a second piece of beef with a bamboo skewer. She closed her eyes and enjoyed the feeling of the delicious beef exploding in her mouth. Her pink lips parted slightly, and she bit into the tender beef as a smile of enjoyment spread across her beautiful face. Gulp! The sound of saliva being swallowed rang out, and it was quite a big commotion. Do they all have to eat so seductively? I feel like the owner is cheating. I can't take it anymore. I feel like I'm going to be melted by her cuteness. I suddenly want a daughter. Her smile is so adorable. Here's the beef skewers. I want to steal the owner's daughter away. Even such a beautiful elf likes to eat beef, so it must be worthy of my temperament. Owner, please give me a beef cube. When the passers-by saw Amy and Irina eating barbecued meat, there was already a commotion. This. Sinclair gulped as he looked at the roast beef cubes in front of Amy and Irina with a curious expression. This was roast beef that had been made from his own ingredients, and he couldn't help but wonder just how delicious it would be. Once you're done, we'll start collecting the money. Meg handed a small plate to Sinclair. There were 5 pieces of beef on it. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mack. Cindy held the plate happily. Gulp. The waiter from Culinary, who was standing at the side, made a clear gulping sound. He slowly turned his head with an awkward expression, and his throat unconsciously moved twice. If you really want to eat it, you can buy it yourself, Meg reminded her considerately. Oomph. The waiter from Culinary turned around. He was so angry that his shoulders were shaking. Oh, the smell of roast beef. It's simply invincible. Who would have thought that truly delicious roast beef would taste like this? In comparison, my roast beef doesn't even deserve to be called roast beef. If I had tasted such delicious roast beef earlier, I wouldn't have come here to set up a roast beef stall. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to call my roast beef the best in the world. Sinclair held the plate in his hands and chewed on the beef with tears streaming down his face. This bearded uncle is really full of emotions. In short, he's very dramatic. Meg shook his head with a sigh and turned around. It was best not to play along with his performance. Otherwise, who knew what kind of show he was going to put on later? Irina and Amy's double whammy had successfully made the customers, who were just here to have fun, fork out money to try Meg's roast beef. 1 silver coin wasn't a high price. Even though it was a little strange to buy a piece of beef, it wasn't a bad idea to try it out. Boss, give me a piece of beef. Boss, I want a piece too. Meg placed a new piece of beef onto the grill as he beckoned to Sinclair, who was still looking up at the sky with tears streaming down his face, to collect the money. Coming. Sinclair set down the empty plate in his hands and wiped away his tears with his apron. He immediately put on a smiling face and began to work as the cashier. In the beginning, Sinclair didn't have much confidence in Meg, but after tasting this delicious roast beef, his heart was filled with confidence. If even such delicious roast beef couldn't beat Carrie's rotisserie, then it had to be that the customers this time were too lousy and didn't know how to appreciate true delicacies. This is such a blissful feeling. Irina's bamboo skewer came into contact with the empty plate, and she was still feeling like she hadn't had enough. The delicious flavor of the roast beef was still wafting through her mouth. Could it be that he's been learning how to cook for the past 3 years? Could it be that he really doesn't like my cooking, so he's learning how to cook on his own? Irina's eyes narrowed slightly as she appraised Meg's departing figure, and she shook her head slightly. That can't be right. He said that my cooking was very delicious and that he wouldn't get sick of it no matter what, so it can't be my fault. After all, I'm still super talented at cooking. Big sister Irina, isn't father's roast beef super delicious? Amy turned to Irina with a proud smile on her little face. Yes, it is. Irina nodded with a proud look on her face. My man naturally can't be bad. The first batch of roast beef was soon ready. The roast beef was still sizzling with oil, and it was delivered directly to the customer. There was no need for seating or packaging, and the roast beef could be eaten as soon as it was purchased. It's so hot, but it's so delicious. I've never tasted such delicious food before. The roast beef is so delicious. Even though I've never tasted roast beef from Carrie's rotisserie, this is the most delicious roast beef I've ever tasted. Boss, give me 10 more. I also want 10 more. All of the customers were heaping praises upon the roast beef, and all of them were enjoying the delicious experience that the roast beef brought to them. However, all of the customers who had finished their roast beef quickly gathered around Meg's rotisserie again and offered to buy more. My apologies, customers, but there's a limit of 1 roast beef per person. Meg stopped Sinclair from taking the money with a smile and said, I have a bet with Carrie's rotisserie today, so there's a limit of 1 roast beef per person. If you like it, you can come to my restaurant to try it. Boss, I only want 1 roast beef. Just 1 more pill would do. You can't be so cruel. Such delicious roast beef, even if there were 100 of them, I would still be able to finish them. I've only just been provoked, and now you're telling me that I can't eat anymore? That's too cruel. A rather fat customer pleaded with a bitter expression. That's right, boss. As long as you sell us one more roast beef per person, we'll all support you. A tall and thin customer chimed in. Mr. Mack, why don't you just sell them one more roast beef? The red-faced Sinclair also chimed in. He had been running this stall for so many days, and this was the first time that he had received so much money that his hands were about to give out. This feeling of being on cloud nine was simply too blissful. My apologies, but rules are rules. Please move on to the next customer. Meg shook his head with a smile, and it was clear that he had no intention of negotiating. Chapter 728. What? How is that possible? In the kitchen of the rotisserie, Ike exclaimed as he listened to a report from a waiter. Many of the customers in the restaurant turned toward the kitchen with perplexed looks on their faces. You're saying that the rotisserie stall only just started roasting meat, and there are already so many customers rushing over to try it? There's even a long line? The waiter nodded with an uneasy expression and replied, That's right. He sells his roast meat by cubes, and each customer can only buy one cube. However, there are still many customers lining up, and those who have finished their roast meat are begging him to buy more. All of the other chefs in the kitchen became rather nervous upon hearing this. This bet wasn't just about a sign. It was also about the reputation of Carrie's rotisserie. If they couldn't even compete with a roadside stall, then what right did they have to call themselves the #1 rotisserie in Rodeo? Ike contemplated the situation momentarily before shaking his head with a confident expression. Don't worry, the customers aren't idiots. How can a roadside stall cook such delicious roast beef? They won't be fooled after tasting it. Let's see how many cubes of roast beef he can sell for 1 silver coin per cube. Carrie's rotisserie is the largest rotisserie in all of Rodeo. All of the chef's eyes lit up upon hearing this. Indeed, how could a single person compare to their entire kitchen? This bet was about the number of customers that they could serve. The delicious roast beef quickly spread like wildfire, and many customers were attracted to the rotisserie. However, the restriction of 1 cube per person was like a fishbone that was stuck in everyone's throat. Some of the customers were still trying to convince the stubborn owner to change the restriction, while most of them had already given up. However, they didn't go too far, and some of them even offered to help promote the rotisserie. They weren't offering to help out because they were moved by the delicious roast beef. Instead, they wanted to see the depressed expressions on the customers' faces after tasting the delicious roast beef, but being unable to get a second cube. Seeing as they had already fallen into the trap, they naturally wanted more people to fall into it as well. Meg's expression was still as calm as ever as he turned down all of the customers' requests and carefully cooked every single cube of roast beef. Sinclair no longer tried to persuade Meg. His attitude was slowly changing. At first, he was worried that Meg's cold attitude would cause a loss of customers, so it was better to sell more to customers that he already liked. However, judging from the line that had already formed outside the stall, this worry was completely unnecessary. Even if each person could only buy one, the business was still booming. This kind of feeling of dominating the entire scene with delicious food really made people feel like they were floating. Even he felt like he was floating. Carrie's waiter, who was in charge of recording the customers, was completely dumbfounded. He held the quill in his hand and kept drawing vertical lines on the paper. He could hardly believe that something like this was happening right under his nose. His hand was getting sore from holding the quill, but the customers and the beef on the grill showed no signs of stopping. Carrie won't lose, right? The waiter thought uncertainly. Even he himself was not sure. What is this little stall selling? Why are there so many customers lining up here? A middle-aged man in a set of lavish robes emerged from a horse-drawn carriage, and he looked at the small stall that had been surrounded by a curious crowd. The entrance of Carrie's rotisserie was almost completely blocked off. Duke, I'll go have a look. A man who appeared to be a butler quickly strode over to the stall. After a short while, he squeezed out of the crowd and straightened out his slightly disheveled clothes as he said in a respectful manner, Duke, this stall is selling roast beef by the cubes, and each cube costs 1 silver coin. Furthermore, the rule is that each person can only buy 1 cube at a time. Beef is being sold by the cubes, and each person can only buy 1 cube? I didn't think that something like this would happen in this world. The man referred to as Duke was a little surprised. He looked at the barbecue stall that was surrounded by so many people that he could only see its signboard. He smiled and said, "But judging from the enthusiasm of these customers, the roast beef must be delicious. Kin, why don't we go and try it?" Duke, with your status, eating from a roadside stall like this? The butler by the name of Kin faltered slightly, but the meaning behind his words was very clear. "I'm here to eat roast beef anyway. The roast beef from Carrie's rotisserie is indeed quite delicious, but perhaps I'll be pleasantly surprised if I can open a small stall right in front of it." The Duke didn't pay any heed to Kin's words as he continued onward. "Duke!" Kin and a saber-wielding guard quickly caught up to him, and they surrounded him in an attempt to force the crowd to disperse. "We're here to eat. Don't use your status to intimidate others." The Duke shook his head as he stopped the butler before taking his place at the very back of the line. The customers nearby were all rather surprised to see the Duke in his lavish robes. Nobles generally disdained to eat from roadside stalls with commoners, as they viewed such behavior as a disgrace to their status. However, this man didn't seem to be a normal noble, but he didn't give off the impression that he was putting on airs. Furthermore, he was standing in the same line as all of the other customers. This aroma really is making me look forward to tasting it. The Duke took a deep breath of the aroma of roast beef wafting through the air, and his eyes immediately lit up as an expectant look appeared on his face. The line continued onward, and the customers who had tasted the roast beef began to sing praises from the bottom of their hearts, tickling the hearts of the customers in the line like feathers. The Duke finally arrived at the stall, and he smiled as he said, "I'd like a cube of beef, boss." "Sure." Meg quickly picked up a cube of beef from the grill with a bamboo skewer before handing it over to the Duke. The waiter from Carrie's rotisserie was still scribbling on a piece of paper when he raised his head, and his eyes widened as he exclaimed, "Duke Abraham." "Greetings, Duke Abraham." The waiter's exclamation immediately created a stir in the crowd, and all of the surrounding customers hurriedly lowered their heads in greeting. Even a duke is coming to eat roast beef from a roadside stall. Is the owner of this stall a chef? Duke Abraham is a very prestigious figure. If he wants more roast beef, Mr. Mac won't be able to turn him down, right? That's a duke we're talking about. If the owner turns him down, he won't be able to live to see the next day. Does that mean we'll have a chance to eat a second cube of beef? All of the customers were discussing quietly among themselves with excitement etched on their faces. The waiter standing at the entrance of Carrie's rotisserie also hurriedly ran into the shop. "It's Duke Abraham." Meg also raised his head with a hint of surprise upon hearing this. Alex didn't have much of an impression of this Duke, who was a man of extremely high status but didn't hold much power. Chapter 729. Among the 10 dukes of the Roth Empire, Abraham wasn't the most powerful one, but he was undoubtedly the best when it came to the food he had eaten. He had chosen to stay in Rodu as an idle duke rather than a vast and rich territory, precisely because he couldn't bear to part with the delicious food in Rodu. If he were to go to other places, he wouldn't be able to eat such delicious food. As such, he had been given the nickname of the Duke of Gluttony. However, he wasn't ashamed of this. Instead, he was quite pleased with himself. How could ordinary people understand the joy of being a glutton? Nothing in this world was more important than delicious food. However, after taking a bite of the beef, Abraham felt as if he had seen the true meaning of life. This was what he had been pursuing all this time. The beef was charred on the outside and tender on the inside, and the juicy meat and delicious beef spread through his mouth. His taste buds began to stir violently, and a peculiar aroma slowly wafted through the air. This was the aroma of black pepper, and it elevated the flavor of the beef to a whole new level. The sizzling piece of beef collided violently in his mind. It was just a small piece of beef, but it made him feel as if a century had passed. It had been a long time since he had tasted something so delectable. Delicious. I don't even know how to describe how delicious it is. Abraham gave Meg a thumbs up with admiration in his eyes. In his eyes, a chef who could cook delicious food was like a skilled craftsman and was worthy of praise and respect. It's so delicious. Boss, give me 10 more cubes. Abraham looked into Meg's eyes as he spoke. It's finally here. All of the customers' eyes lit up. Meg had rejected everyone just then, and no one had been able to get a second piece of beef from him. Now that the Duke was the one making the request, would Meg make an exception? Father won't make an exception for no good reason. Amy shook her head. Irina looked up at Meg's departing figure. Is he still so stubborn? My apologies, Your Excellency, but each person is only allowed to buy one piece of beef at a time. Meg shook his head with a smile. Rules were rules, and if they were changed, then they would be meaningless. He refused. The customers were surprised. The Duke had personally asked, but the owner of a small stall actually refused. You're still stubborn. A smile appeared on Irina's face. Mr. Mack, this is the Grand Duke. The Grand Duke. Sinclair tugged on Meg's sleeve as he cautioned in a quiet voice. Sweat was dripping down his forehead from his anxiety. How could Meg treat all of these esteemed guests equally? Wasn't he afraid of losing his head? Ken looked at Meg and sternly said, Do you know who you were talking to? How dare you talk about rules in front of the Duke? Meg's expression remained calm as he replied, The rules weren't made for Your Excellency. They're just a temporary rule. Due to the bet with Carrie's rotisserie, I had no choice but to follow this rule. I hope Your Excellency can forgive me. Ken. Abraham raised a hand to signal for Ken to back down before turning to Meg with a smile and said, Boss, may I ask what kind of bet you have with Carrie's rotisserie? If 10 isn't enough, can you sell me another one? I was just passing by this place today. Meg gave Abraham a brief explanation of the bet. This Duke was quite amicable, and he wasn't as arrogant as the average noble. I see. I agree with you. It would be terrible if all delicacies had to be categorized by class. There are many delicious foods hidden in the roadside stalls. Abraham nodded in agreement before casting his gaze toward Carrie's rotisserie with a smile and said, Seeing as you're going to take on the largest rotisserie in the United States on your own, I'm naturally not going to break your rules. Abraham pointed at Ken and the guard beside him with a smile and said, But those two should be able to buy a cube of beef each, right? Of course they can, seeing as they've lined up. Meg nodded with a smile. Abraham departed with 2 cubes of beef in his hand, and a content expression appeared on his face. Gluttons were always able to think of a way to eat delicious food. Ken quickly caught up with him with a peculiar expression on his face, and he looked at Abraham with a perplexed expression as he asked, Aren't you going to Carrie's rotisserie, Duke? Is there a better rotisserie there? Abraham asked with a smile. Ken didn't know how to respond. Once you've tasted a truly delicious dish, you won't be interested in any other dish. Abraham looked at the beef in his hand and sighed as he said, It looks like I won't be interested in rotisserie from other restaurants in the future. It's a good thing that His Excellency is a reasonable person. Cindy wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead, and he felt as if his heart were about to leap out of his throat. In contrast, Meg was as calm as a placid lake. So this is a rule that Boss Carrie's rotisserie set up to force them to tear down the sign. Even His Excellency is following the rules. Let's not add to Boss Carrie's troubles. Didn't His Excellency teach us the correct way to buy a second cube of beef? I'll go get him right away. Complex expressions appeared on the faces of the customers. They had initially wanted His Excellency to break Meg's rules, but who would have thought that His Excellency would be more obedient than anyone else? However, most of the customers in front of the stall were commoners, and they were already displeased with the signs that were plastered on the doors of noble restaurants. As such, they were very supportive of Meg's decision, and no one asked for another cube of beef from Meg. After Duke Abraham tasted the beef from the stall, he was full of praises for it. Chapter 730. All of the customers who had missed out on the roast beef were still lamenting, but they gradually quieted down upon hearing Meg's announcement. News of the bet between Meg and Carrie's rotisserie had already spread, and all of the customers in the line had heard a little about it. A small, obscure stall was challenging the most renowned rotisserie on the food street, and that in itself was quite a commotion. Furthermore, it was rumored that Duke Abraham had just paid a visit to this stall and was full of praise for the roast beef, but he didn't even enter Carrie's rotisserie. Now that Meg had announced the result of the bet, everyone immediately turned their attention to the waiter from Carrie's rotisserie. The waiter was beginning to panic a little at the sight of so many people staring at him, and he stuttered, You don't even know how many customers our rotisserie has served. How could you win? That's bullshit." "Humph. How dare a small rotisserie stall make such a claim? Our rotisserie has served a total of 735 customers in just one afternoon. How can you compare with us?" Right at this moment, Ike strode out of the rotisserie with a smug and arrogant expression as he appraised Meg. The evening rush hour hadn't even begun yet, but Carrie's rotisserie had already served so many customers. Almost all of the seats in the restaurant had been filled to the brim with customers, so how could a small roadside stall compare to this? "Head chef." The waiter immediately found his backbone, and he quickly made his way over to Ike's side with renewed confidence as he appraised Meg with a smug expression. "Over 700 customers. Carrie's rotisserie really is one of the top 3 restaurants on the food street." All of the stall owners sighed with emotion. Even if they were to set up a stall here for an entire day, only a few of them would be able to serve 700 customers, so how are they going to compete with Carrie's rotisserie? Can the owner of this rotisserie win? All of the customers who had been quite confident were now looking at Meg with concern in their eyes. "Father has never lost before," Amy said confidently without the slightest bit of worry on her face. Irina nodded in agreement. "That's right. How could he lose? He's my man." Meg looked at the smug Ike with a smile and said, "Actually, the total number of customers that have entered your rotisserie since noon today is 736, and I've included the baby you're holding in your arms. However, my apologies, but I sold a total of 1,472 cubes of beef this afternoon. Each person is limited to 1 cube, and none of them are duplicates. As such, I served a total of 1,472 customers, which is exactly double the number of customers that your rotisserie receives." Mag extended 2 fingers. The whole place was silent. Everyone's eyes lit up when they saw Mag's too. How could this be? In less than 5 hours, he had received 1,472 customers. Carrie's rotisserie. He extended a hand, and the piece of paper that was hovering in midair slowly drifted down before landing on his long and slender hands. It appeared to be brand new, and there wasn't even the slightest crack on it. "What powerful spatial magic!" someone on the second floor exclaimed in amazement. "It's Grandpa Principal," Amy yelled with elation as she placed the chair back onto the ground, putting on an obedient expression. Irina also casually tossed the chair aside and pursed her lips as she said, "Old man Novin, you're still as cool as ever." The surrounding people consciously took a few steps back. This was clearly a powerful magician. Meg was also a little surprised to see this man, but he still nodded in response. "Principal Novin." Everyone from Carrie's rotisserie also stopped in their tracks upon seeing this. If this man was only a rotisserie stall owner like Meg, then they wouldn't dare to do anything. However, if this man was a powerful magic caster, then they didn't dare to do anything. Ike's heart settled a little upon seeing that Novin's robe didn't bear the insignia of the Magus Tower. He turned to Novin with a cold expression and said, Who are you? This has nothing to do with you. It's between me and him, so you better stay out of this. This is Rodu. There are some people you can't afford to mess with." "Shut up. Do you know that he's the most powerful spatial magic caster on the Norland continent? You're just a lowly chef who's only fit to cook for commoners, but he's going to cook for the king tomorrow." Chapter 731. The crowd parted to reveal a lavish unicorn carriage, and a young man in a set of lavish purplish-blue robes stood atop the carriage with a cold expression on his face. "It's His Highness!" someone in the crowd exclaimed in surprise, and a small commotion ensued. Judging from what His Highness just said, that robed man is a spatial magic caster, and the owner of that roast meat stall is going to cook for the king tomorrow. In that case, the roast meat we ate today was cooked by a chef who's going to cook for the king. I can brag about this for an entire year. Only a year? I can brag about this for the rest of my life. However, everyone was more focused on Josh's words, which had completely stunned everyone present. This. Sinclair stared at Meg with wide eyes, and he was at a complete loss for words. This feeling was akin to living in a slum, only to have someone suddenly come over and ask to stay in your house for a night, only to wake up the next day and tell you that he's actually the king. For a chef, being able to cook for the king in the palace was akin to being a king among chefs. And such a thing actually happened to him. What a miraculous day. Hearing that voice, Ike's face instantly paled. His legs trembled, and he fell to his knees uncontrollably. Ike looked at the calm and collected Mag, and he was still unable to believe that this man was going to enter the palace to cook for the king. If his culinary skills were so exceptional, and he had such a lofty status, why would he set up a stall in front of his rotisserie with those lowly commoners for the sake of a mere notice? This is simply bullying. Ike was on the verge of tears, and a sense of horror welled up in his heart as he looked at Josh, who had disembarked from the carriage and was making his way toward the roast meat shop. A great magic caster and a chef who was going to cook for the king. No matter how he thought about it, those two were far more prestigious than him. No matter how he thought about it, he couldn't think of a way to extricate himself from this situation. Why is he here? Meg looked at Joshua, who had alighted from the carriage and was nodding at the commoners with a smile on his face. Then, he anxiously looked in Irina's direction. Irina, who was originally standing beside Amy, was nowhere to be seen. Meg felt slightly relieved. Although he didn't know if Irina had already guessed his and Amy's identities, judging from her behavior, she probably didn't trust Joshua too much. According to the information he had read, Irina and Joshua used to have a good friendship. "Josh, what did you do behind my back? If you really did have something to do with what happened back then, I'll kill you with my own hands," Irina murmured to herself as she stood by the window of a secluded private room. Meg withdrew his gaze and looked at Meg again, then at Ike, who was trembling uncontrollably on the ground. It didn't take him much effort, but he had garnered even more support from the commoners. As for that bastard, he doesn't deserve to be a chef. Even if we don't kick him out of Rodu, from today onward, he doesn't deserve to be a chef in any restaurant, Josh said with a cold expression. "Thank you for your kindness, Your Highness, thank you." I kowtowed. It was already extremely fortunate for him to be able to stay in Rodu. I only went to the washroom, and it's already quite lively here. Looks like our second prince has done something to be praised again. Right at this moment, a mocking voice sounded as Crassus made his way over to Novin with Amy in tow. He turned to Novin with a smile and said, "You're here too? Let's go have a drink later?" "Master Crassus." Josh extended a respectful salute before turning to Amy with a surprised smile and said, "So Mr. Meg's daughter is Master Crassus' new disciple? Your acting is a little clumsy, but I'll make do with it. If there's nothing else, I'm going to go have a drink with Mr. Mac and the others with my obedient disciple." Crassus waved a hand as he prepared to leave. Chapter 732. The commotion in front of Carrie's rotisserie gradually died down, and news of the second prince's announcement that all nobles and commoners would be treated equally quickly spread throughout the entire food street. The reason for this was that a legendary chef had set up a small stall and single-handedly defeated Carrie's rotisserie. Countless versions of this story had already been created, and each version was more exciting and thrilling than the last. However, regardless of which version it was, that chef was already viewed as a hero, a hero who had fought for the respect and equal treatment of commoners. A restaurant by the name of Mamie began to spread throughout Rendezvous' culinary circle. Many customers who couldn't forget about the roast beef began to search for information about this restaurant through various channels. However, no matter how well-versed all of the restaurants in Rendezvous were, none of them were able to find out anything about this restaurant, let alone its location. Thankfully, they had heard that the mysterious chef was going to cook for the king the next day, so they should be able to divulge more information. After all, even Duke Abraham was full of praise for this roast beef, so there was no way that it would disappear just like that. The cheers of the commoners also made the owners of the nobles' restaurants feel rather conflicted. Nobles who dared to label their restaurants as off-limits to commoners didn't have to worry about customers. On the other hand, the label of a noble restaurant could attract even more nobles to the restaurant, thereby generating a lot of revenue for the restaurant. However, no one dared to defy the second prince's orders. The head chef of Carrie's rotisserie was the chicken that had been punished to serve as a warning to all of the owners who tried to bluff their way out of this situation. Just who was that guy? He came out of nowhere and caused such a stir. Many people heaved internal sighs as they began to think about how to deal with the displeasure of the nobles. Congratulations, host. You've completed your mission. One stinky tofu recipe has been issued. Within a booth facing the street, the system's voice sounded in Meg's mind. At the same time, a shimmering golden experience bag appeared in Meg's mind. Stinky tofu. It really is a little monster that I both love and hate. Meg fell into deep thought as he looked at the experience bag. Host, I didn't think that you would have such a strong taste. The system grumbled. Meg thought for a while and said, this is one of the kings of roadside stalls. Its stench dominates the entire street and looks down on everyone. However, it's not suitable for eating in a restaurant. Stinky tofu was known as a dark cuisine. For those who loved it, it was a delicacy. For those who hated it, the smell of it would make them want to avoid it. Such a delicacy with a strong smell was indeed not suitable to be added to a restaurant's menu. That was because even Meg wasn't sure if he could hold on in the kitchen, let alone imagine that the entire dining room would be enveloped by the smell of stinky tofu. It's such a classic dish. It's really a waste if I don't learn it. However, it's not suitable to be sold in restaurants after I learn it. As expected, it's most suitable for roadside stalls. Meg thought in his heart with slight hesitation. It took Meg an entire afternoon to complete the system mission and, at the same time, to promote the banning of the aristocratic restaurants in the gourmet street. This matter was quite meaningful to him. Father, are you thinking about big sister Irina? Amy swung Meg's arm from side to side. Meg came to his senses and turned to Amy. I can see that you've been in a daze ever since I told you that big sister Irina had already left. Amy's little face was filled with a knowing expression, and she smiled as she said, Don't worry, big sister Irina said that she'll come to see me again. When that time comes, I'll definitely bring you along. You have to work hard. Meg didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the sight of Amy, who was enthusiastically trying to set him up with Irina. Amy leaned over to Meg's ear and whispered, Big sister Irina told me to keep an eye on you and not let other women get close to you. This means that she also has feelings for you. Meg's eyelids twitched. He didn't expect such a high-level spy to be so close to him. Then, is Amy going to be bribed just like that? How can that be? I'm on father's side. Amy shook her head resolutely. Meg breathed a sigh of relief. At least the little girl still had a conscience. But big sister Irina is a good girl. Father, you can't let her down. So, I'll still help her keep an eye on father. If any woman comes close to you with bad intentions, I'll burn her with a small fireball. Amy said with a serious face, My biological mother is really different. We've only met for a short while, and she's already successfully turned Amy over. Meg silently complained in his heart. He nodded helplessly and said, Okay, I'll do as you say. That's great. Amy clapped her little hands with elation. If father could be together with big sister Irina, then it would be a very good thing. When mother came back, they would be able to live happily together. Crassus and Novin had gone out for a while, and both of them returned as soon as all of the dishes had been served. Even though he was curious, Meg didn't ask any questions. However, he had a feeling that Crassus and Novin seemed to be hiding some kind of secret. Dinner brought Meg some joy and surprise. This was the most famous restaurant on the food street. Its signature roast chicken was indeed very delicious, and the other dishes were also quite delicious. Compared to the restaurants in Chaos City, it really wasn't on the same level. Looks like it won't be easy to become the god of cookery on the Norland continent. Meg picked up a crystal-clear pastry with a serious expression. However, at the same time, his heart was filled with confidence. He was the chosen one, and on his path to becoming the god of cookery, he had to succeed or die trying. There was no other path that he could take. However, he definitely wasn't going to die so easily. Novin put down his chopsticks and turned to Meg with a smile as he asked, "Mr. Mac, is this your first time in Rodu?" Meg hesitated momentarily before nodding with a smile and replied, "You could say that. What do you think of Rodu as compared to Chaos City?" Novin asked. Mag pondered seriously for a moment before replying. Chaos City is a place where the word equality can be found everywhere. However, for the commoners of Rodu, this is only an extravagant hope. Just based on this, I feel that Chaos City is more suitable for me. A gratified smile appeared on Novin's face, and he sighed as he said, "Equality is extremely difficult to achieve. Even Chaos City is far from achieving true equality. There's no such thing as true equality in the human heart. Who can truly be selfless and selfless? However, everyone has their own path, and that's equality." Meg shook his head. Novin's eyes lit up, and he nodded with a smile as he said, "Mr. Mac really is an interesting person." Chapter 733. Are you serious, Principal? Asking a restaurant owner about the power of the world? Meg's eyelids twitched as he looked at the serious Novin. Being stared at by those wise eyes reminded him of being stared at by a primary school principal. After a moment of serious thought, Meg cleared his throat and said, "I think that the power of the world is bound to be divided after a long period of union, and it's bound to be united after a long period of separation. It's not something that an individual can interfere with, and it's not something that a chef like me can predict. It's bound to be divided after a long period of union, and it's bound to be united after a long period of separation." Novin murmured softly before suddenly bursting into laughter. "Haha, great. I didn't think that Mr. Mac would be able to see through this better than us old fellows. Division and unification are indeed the power of the world, and it's not something that can be stopped by humans. Looks like this continent is going to be chaotic again." Crassus sighed as he took a sip from his wine glass. He didn't seem to be in a very good mood. Meg looked at the two of them and didn't say anything else. He had a vague feeling that something big was about to happen. Could it have something to do with the king's birthday banquet tomorrow? Only Amy was happily eating the delicacies in front of her. Her little tummy was so big that it seemed like it could fit an elephant. After dinner, Crassus and Novin left together, while Meg took Amy back to the second prince's residence in a horse-drawn carriage. Along the way, the coachman, who had been knocked unconscious by Irina's chair in the morning, carefully asked Meg what had happened to him today. Meg naturally diverted this matter to the accident caused by Sean, and successfully removed himself from this matter. At the same time, he pushed the blame to Sean. Meg didn't have to worry about whether this would add another grudge between Sean and Josh, who were already on bad terms with each other. What he had to worry about now was going to the palace to cook for the king the next day. Apart from grilled fish, steak, and braised chicken, Meg also prepared the ultimate trump card for the king who loved desserts, ice cream cake. After washing up, Amy lay on the bed with Meg's arm as her pillow. She looked at Meg with her big eyes and whispered, "Father, big sister Irina said today that she knows Mother and that she's the most beautiful elf in the elf tribe. Is that true?" "How dare you?" Meg rolled his eyes in his mind, but when he saw Amy's expectant gaze, his heart softened. He smiled and nodded as he said gently, "Yes, your mother is the most beautiful elf in the world. She's as beautiful as Irina. Didn't you say you didn't like big sister Irina? Now you've let the cat out of the bag, haven't you? Amy smiled smugly. Meg was noncommittal and asked with a smile, then does Amy like her? Yes, of course I do. Amy nodded without hesitation. Then she smiled and said, when I lay in her arms, I felt like I was lying in my mother's arms. It was so warm. It was completely different from when I lay in the arms of teacher Luna and big sister Yabamiya. Amy had a sweet smile on her face. She closed her eyes and fell asleep with a smile on her face. Because she's your mother. Meg looked at Amy, who was lying on his arm, and gently kissed her forehead before closing his eyes as well. Amy, little Amy, this little girl is so sensible and cute, but I've never taken care of a child before. How am I going to get along with her in the future? I heard that there are a lot of kidnappers nowadays. Should I tie her up with a rope? I heard that children are very picky when it comes to food. Will she dislike the food I make? I heard, at the window of an exquisite room, a figure sat on the windowsill, swinging her legs as she muttered to herself. She seemed to be in a dilemma. At the edge of the wind forest, a beautiful elf emerged from the bushes with her hands on her hips. She murmured to herself with a vexed expression, "It's already the 16th day. Did those guys really cancel the deal?" There were some leaves on her body and hair, and her clothes were a little dirty and disheveled. She had 2 dark circles under her eyes, and she looked very fatigued. Tomorrow is the birthday of the king of the Roth Empire. Princess Irina has already gone to Rodu. If they didn't cancel the deal, then it's most likely going to happen in the next 2 days. She looked in the direction of the wind forest, and her expression became resolute again. She turned and disappeared into the dense forest. In the study of the second prince's manor, Josh stood behind his desk with his brows slightly furrowed. Looks like Sean is also suspicious of Meg's identity. That's why he allowed his subordinates to crash into my horse-drawn carriage today. He didn't think that Irina and Crassus would both be in the carriage. Zeus had already returned to Rodu, and he was concealed in the darkness. He said in a hoarse voice, "Your Highness, we still haven't found out who this man is. Could he really be Alex in disguise? Both the timing and the daughter fit the description too well. Do you think Alex would set up a roast beef stall and sell roast beef for an entire afternoon just to tear down the sign on the door of a roast beef restaurant? Would he be able to make his customers fall in love with his roast beef? He definitely wouldn't do something like that." Meg woke up early the next morning. After helping Amy wash up, the butler knocked on his door. "Mr. Meg, are you ready? I'm here to take you to the royal palace," the butler said with a smile. "Us?" Meg was slightly surprised to hear this. He was only a chef, after all, and an important occasion like the king's birthday banquet naturally wouldn't allow a chef to bring his family into the royal palace. He had even considered the possibility of having Amy stay in the second prince's manor alone for a day. The smile on the butler's face became even more respectful as he said, "His Highness said that Master Crassus has already informed him that Amy will be accompanying him to the royal palace as his disciple." The second prince's manor was very close to the Magus Tower, so it was no secret that Amy had defeated Kola as a 5th-tier magic caster. A prodigy like her was destined to become an important figure in the future. "Thank you for your help." Meg was enlightened. With Crassus' status, it wasn't a big deal for him to bring his only disciple to the king's birthday banquet. In the horse-drawn carriage, Amy whispered into Meg's ear, "Father, will we see big sister Irina today?" "Most likely," Meg nodded before whispering. "But Amy can't act too familiar with big sister Irina in the royal palace." "I know. Big sister Irina is so beautiful, so there must be a lot of people who want to marry her. If they find out that father wants to marry her as well, they'll definitely try to get back at father. I'll pretend that I'm not familiar with big sister Irina." Amy nodded obediently. "Good girl." Meg patted Amy's head with a peculiar expression. The horse-drawn carriage drove into the Grand Royal Palace, and after it came to a stop, Meg and Amy drew back the curtain to reveal a human-sized wooden birdman sculpture. What an ugly birdman. I was scared to death. Chapter 734. The wooden birdman that appeared in front of the carriage was sent flying 3 meters away by Amy's kick. It landed with a clang, creating a huge hole in the garden at the side and crushing a patch of chrysanthemums. Your Highness, are you all right? Hurry and get His Highness out. A large group of people rushed forward and pulled at the bird's head while shouting in a panic. Meg and Amy stared at the birdman that was as tall as a human lying on the ground in a daze. The golden wooden wings carved out of it were very lifelike, and each piece was independent. They even had a metallic luster under the sun. The bird's beak and eyes were also very beautiful, just like a golden rock. The craftsmanship was so exquisite that Meg was a little amazed. If one were to look at it at first glance, it would indeed be a little difficult to distinguish the real from the fake. However, such a huge bird was just standing there without flapping its wings. Furthermore, it was in the palace. It was no wonder that Amy, who had just come out of the carriage, kicked it out instinctively. If it were Meg, he probably wouldn't have been able to resist the kick either. However, Meg raised his eyebrows when he saw the group of panicking guards. Your Highness? Wooden carving. Could it be that carpenter prince in this wooden carving? The third prince, who loved wood carving, rarely appeared in Alex's memory. The third prince, who had a noble status, was obsessed with wood carving, and had no interest in fighting for the throne or power. If it wasn't an occasion where he had to appear, he basically wouldn't participate. Many people had even forgotten that there was a third prince in the Roth Empire. This talent is indeed not cut out to be a prince. Meg couldn't help but praise in his heart as he looked at the exquisite wooden carving. Stop, stop, stop. Which fool is pulling my head? If you continue, it's going to fall off. A somewhat immature voice sounded. The two knights who were grabbing the birdman's head were about to exert force together, but when they heard that, they quickly let go. With a clang, the bird's head fell to the ground again. Ugh! A painful sound came from the bird's head. Your Highness! Everyone panicked and hurriedly picked up the bird's head again. Forget it. Help me up first, you fools. A helpless voice came from the birdman. The guards hurriedly helped the wooden birdman stand up. Amy's kick wasn't light. A few feathers on the birdman's chest were broken, and some of the feathers on its back were also broken and stained with chrysanthemum juice. It was like a damaged piece of art. It was a pity. Capture them. The leader of the guards waved his hand, and 5 or 6 armed guards surrounded Meg's horse-drawn carriage, preparing to arrest him. The steward who brought Meg and the rest here was a little nervous. He said, Leader, this is the chef that His Highness the Second Prince invited from Chaos City to cook for His Majesty's birthday celebration. If there's any misunderstanding, please forgive him. The steward who was responsible for bringing Meg and the rest into the palace was naturally not a fool. There were only 3 people in the Roth Empire who could be addressed as His Highness. The first prince and the second prince naturally couldn't be in this wooden carving, so the one who was sent flying by Amy's kick was naturally the third prince. Although the second prince had a high status and was doted on by the king, attacking the third prince in the palace was a crime that could cost him his head. Furthermore, the second prince would definitely draw the line between himself and this matter. When that happened, he might even become an abandoned pawn. This kind of thing was taboo. The leader of the guards stepped forward and coldly said to that steward, Do you know who you attacked just now? Even if it's the second prince's people, we have to capture all of them today. Let's see who has the guts to attack His Highness the third prince. That steward stuttered and didn't know how to respond. The leader of the guards waved his hand and coldly said, Capture them. All the guards stepped forward with their swords half drawn. They looked at Meg and Amy warily. To be able to send the third prince, who was wearing a wooden carving robe, flying with a kick, her strength was already comparable to a second-tier knight. I should have checked the almanac before going out today. How could something like this happen? Mag heaved an internal sigh as he shielded Amy behind him. He wondered if he should use Krasu's name as a deterrent, but he didn't know if Krasu's name would be useful in the royal palace. All of you, idiots, back off. An angry voice sounded from within the wooden birdman statue. It spread open its wings and patted its belly clumsily like a penguin. It seemed to be trying to press something down, but its wings couldn't reach it. It looked a little silly and adorable. The leader of the guards hesitated momentarily before waving his hand to signal for all of the guards to back off. Meow, Ugly Duckling stared at it for a while before rolling around in Amy's arms with laughter. Look, father. Even though this birdman is ugly, it's so funny. I feel like it's a little adorable. Amy faltered momentarily before also giggling. Meg's expression was also a little peculiar. This mighty and domineering rock was indeed a little hilarious now. It really is, a little adorable. Even the guards were trying their best to suppress their laughter, and their faces were all red from holding back their laughter. The birdman jumped on the spot and angrily said, "All of you idiots, what are you looking at? Hurry up and press down that slightly protruding feather on my belly. My wings are crooked, and I can't reach it myself." Ha ha ha, this is so funny. Amy was rocking back and forth with laughter, and almost threw Ugly Duckling out of her hands. Coming, coming. All of the guards hurriedly rushed over and pressed down on the feather in a flurry. They finally pressed down on the feather. Crack, crack. Following a series of chaotic sounds, a crack appeared in the middle of the birdman's head and body. It then slowly fell to the sides, and a big-headed young man jumped out from within with his hand covering his red nose. "Your Highness, are you all right?" The leader of the guards asked with a concerned expression. "You idiot, what could possibly happen to me? It's just a bump on my nose." The young man reached out to push the leader's head away, causing him to bleed. Blood. His Highness is bleeding. Hurry up and call the doctor over. All of the guards were shocked and began to yell in a flurry. What a bunch of idiots. You won't die from a nosebleed. The young man pulled out a white silk handkerchief from his pocket and casually rolled it up before stuffing a corner under his nose. He looked at Meg and Amy, who were still in the carriage, with interest in his eyes, and frowned as he said, "You two idiots look so unfamiliar. Is this your first time in the palace?" After that, his gaze descended onto Amy, and he said with a curious expression, "Besides that, you little fool. Even though you're small, your eyesight is really formidable. You actually saw through the ugliness of my wooden carving?" Chapter 735. This young man appeared to be around 14 or 15 years old, and there were a few freckles on his nose. His head was close to twice the size of a normal person's head, but his body and limbs were quite thin and frail. At first glance, he really did resemble a large mushroom. Meg tried his best not to burst into laughter. This was none other than the third prince of the Roth Empire, Yuri. Even Alex wouldn't be able to forget his appearance, so Meg had a clear memory of him. He was a little older than he had been 3 years ago, and his head was just as eye-catching. Meg felt like it would be very difficult for him to forget him just by looking at him. There weren't many people in this world who had such a unique appearance. "How dare you? How dare you address the third prince as his highness?" The leader of the guards yelled with a stern expression. Yuri raised a hand to silence the leader of the guards. There wasn't even a hint of anger on his face as he took a few steps forward. He appraised Amy for a while before asking, "Little Mushroom Head, do you know Big Sister Irina?" "No way." Meg raised an eyebrow. Things didn't seem to be as simple as they seemed. Amy looked up at Meg before shaking her head. "No, I don't. I think you two look quite alike. Both of you have silver hair and pointy ears." Yuri propped his chin up with one hand as he appraised and said, "Big Sister Irina once said that if she gave birth to a daughter in the future, she would marry her to me." "No, she didn't. Don't spout nonsense." Before Amy had a chance to say anything, Meg had already interjected with a stern expression. There was already a hint of danger in his eyes as he looked at Yuri. Anyone who tried to lay their hands on Amy, even if it was just a hypothetical young man, was his enemy. If they were in another place, he would have already drawn his sword. Amy and Yuri both turned to Meg in unison. "Father, What's wrong? Amy asked as she turned to Meg with a perplexed expression. Are you rejecting me, you big idiot? Yuri was also perplexed. Oh, it's nothing. I just think that she might be talking nonsense and not taking it seriously at all. Mag concealed the dangerous look in his eyes. This was the royal palace, after all. However, he was going to keep this in mind. After he reunited with Irina, he had to get her to cancel this messy betrothal between the two of them. Amy was still so young. When it came to marriage, he would not even consider it. He refused to think about it. Otherwise, he wouldn't mind letting the Roth Empire have one less prince. Really? That's great. Yuri's eyes lit up upon hearing this, and he patted his own chest with an elated expression as he said, This has been my nightmare for so many years. I don't know which idiot would want to marry someone as violent as big sister Irina. Her daughter is probably the same as her. If she has forgotten, that would be great. Wood carving is so much fun. Large, flat stones were used to build palaces. The golden, translucent tiles shone dazzlingly under the sunlight. In front of these palaces, people were as small as ants. Even if one said that this was the palace of a dragon, no one would doubt it. Although Mag was someone who had experienced the baptism of the Forbidden City, he was still awestruck by the most magnificent palace in this alternate world when he saw this magnificent palace that was dozens of meters tall. Mr. Meg, please come this way. The carriage was filled with all kinds of equipment and marinated ingredients. The coachman had already alighted from the carriage and was holding the reins as he spoke to Meg respectfully. Meg retracted his gaze and looked at the huge house in front of him that also occupied a large area and had the words dining hall written on it. He smiled and nodded. Okay. As they walked toward the door, Meg could already vaguely hear the sounds of pots and pans. He could already imagine what a lively scene it would be in this kitchen. On this day, this was going to be a competition between the best chefs on the entire Norland continent. All of the most recognized chefs in the chef's world had already arrived, and whoever could receive the king's approval would become the uncrowned king of the day. Chapter 736. Outside the royal palace, in a dimly lit room, three burly figures were seated across from each other. The hottest blood of the orc warriors has already been spilled on the border between our tribe and the Roth Empire. I hope that you demons and forest trolls can show us your true sincerity instead of just paying lip service, the dark green-skinned orc said in a low voice. Don't worry, the most elite warriors of our forest trolls have already arrived at Rodu. I guarantee that Irina won't be able to return alive this time. The forest troll twisted his neck, and a cracking sound rang out. It was as if the sound had been forced out of his lungs. A cold light flashed through the spatial demon's crimson eyes as he sneered. The power structure of this world will be redefined by our alliance. Elves, humans, goblins, these weak and cunning things should obediently become food. They don't deserve to have territory, and they don't deserve to be on equal footing with us. Let them start with internal strife. Meg carried a box of knives as he slowly walked into the massive kitchen. This was the first time that he had seen a kitchen that was almost as large as a football field. There were rows upon rows of neat rows, and there was almost no space left. There were over 1,000 chefs in the kitchen. These 1,000 or so chefs were the most exceptional chefs on the Norland continent. They had gathered here today just to present a delicious dish to the king on his birthday. It's even more spectacular than I imagined. Meg thought to himself as he looked at the demon chef who was slicing through the food like the wind, the forest troll who was holding a wok with his head on fire, and the elven chef who was cooking as elegantly as if he were casting magic. The chefs of different races were displaying one incredible scene after another. All types of wondrous fragrances wafted through the kitchen, and the sounds of pots and spatulas intertwined to form a beautiful melody. It was probably a melody that every chef would love. Mag looked around with great interest. This was the first time he had seen so many people in the same industry using different cooking styles to make delicacies. He was like Granny Lou who had entered the Grandview garden. There were endless wonders to be seen. "Mr. Meg, your cooking position is here. The dishes will be served in 2 hours. I hope you can be ready." The guard who led Megan stopped and pointed to an empty seat beside him. He looked at Meg and asked, "Are you alone?" Meg put the knife box on the stove and looked at the guard with a puzzled expression. He nodded and said, "Yes, is there anything wrong?" "I'm just a little surprised. Even Kalulu, who only makes one cold dish, has 2 helpers." The guard glanced at the chef beside Meg and said with a smile, "Then, I wish you good luck." Then, he turned around and left. "Thank you." Meg nodded slightly. Along the way, those chefs did seem to have helpers by their side. On the contrary, he was the only one who stood out. "Let's just make a Calula cucumber dish." He gave us 3 spots. What's he doing by himself? Could it be that he makes peanuts? Shoo, don't talk nonsense. Peanuts are on the same level as us. The 3 chefs at the nearby stall whispered among themselves. Mag turned his head to look at the chef's seat next to him. A rather chubby man in a white chef's suit was smiling at him in a simple and honest manner, and he returned Mag's smile politely. This middle-aged man's body shape was somewhat similar to Dubai's. Even his face shape was completely identical, and he naturally had good looks. There were 2 chubby boys around him who were around 15 or 16 years old. They were all miniature versions of him, and Meg didn't believe that they weren't his sons. The middle-aged man looked at Meg with a curious expression. "Hello, my name is Kalulu. These are Kakalu and Lakaka, and they're my sons." "Brother, what do you do for a living? Why are you by yourself?" The 2 chubby boys also looked at Meg with curious expressions. They were the ones with the least number of chefs here, and they didn't even dare to raise their heads in front of the other chefs. However, this man was by himself, and a sense of superiority welled up in their hearts. Kalulu, Kakalu, Luca. Meg felt as if he was about to faint. These names were really random. He looked at the 3 curious boys with a smile and said, "I'm Meg. I don't have much to cook, so I don't need any helpers." According to Josh's requirements, he only needed to cook a dish for around 10 people. That was a piece of cake for him, so he didn't need any helpers. I understand. Kalulu nodded with a knowing expression. Even though being chosen to cook for the king's birthday banquet was something to be proud of, it was still a little embarrassing for him to only be able to cook a cold dish in front of so many renowned chefs. He could completely empathize with Mag's feelings. "It's fine, Brother Meg. Even though we don't have as many people as they do, and the dishes we cook may not be able to be served on the king's table, we have an easy time. Look at that troll over there with a big pot on his head. His head is red from the heat, and the little trolls around him are all circling around him. It's so tiring." Kalulu smiled as he explained to Meg. "You're right." Meg nodded in confusion. It seemed that the middle-aged man had misunderstood something. However, he didn't have any intention of explaining himself. Instead, he instructed the guards to set up the kitchen utensils. "Put this over here, and that over there. Give me the condiments. Father, does he need that many utensils to cook a cold dish? Why do we only need a basin?" Lukaka asked with a perplexed look on his face. He must have moved his entire kitchen here. Although he can only make one cold dish, he still has to pretend that his cold dish is very classy. This is something that we should learn from. I miscalculated. Kakalu stroked his chin and said with a resolute expression. A nostalgic look appeared on Kalula's face as he said, "Don't talk nonsense. Every chef has their own pride. I can understand Brother Meg's actions very well. Back when I first entered the palace, I even brought a large jar of pickled cucumbers with me. I was worried that others would think that I was just a pickled cucumber. I just wanted to show them that even pickled cucumbers aren't something that just anyone can pickle well. Not everyone has a large jar of pickled cucumbers. Kalyulu looked at his two sons with a serious expression and said, "Look, he's probably at the same stage as I was back then. We have to tolerate him and protect his mentality. We shouldn't mock him." You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.